One, two, three. What has become of the fourth, my dear Timaios, of our yesterday's guests and our entertainers of today? He has fallen sick, Socrates. He would not willingly have been missing at this gathering. Then it is for you and your companions, is it not, to fulfill the part of our absent friend? Unquestionably, and we will omit nothing that lies in our power, for indeed it would not be fair, seeing how well we were entertained by you yesterday, that the rest of us should not hardly requite you with the fitting return of hospitality. Do you remember the extent and scope of the subjects I appointed for your discussion? In part we remember, and whatever we have forgotten, you are here to add our memory. But I should prefer, if it is not troublesome, that you should briefly recapitulate them from beginning to end, that they may be more firmly fixed in our minds. I will. The main subject of my discourse yesterday was a political constitution, and the kind of principles and citizens which seemed to me likely to render it most perfect. Yes, and what you said, Socrates, was very much to the satisfaction of us all. Was not our first step to separate the agriculture class and tradesmen in general from those who were to be the defenders of our state? It was. And in deciding on natural principles, but once a pursuit or craft which was suited to each citizen severely, we declared that those whose duty it was to fight on behalf of the community must be guardians only of the city, in case any one, whether without or within her walls, should seek to injure her, and that they should give judgment merciful to their subjects and natural friends, but show themselves stern to the enemies they met in battle. Quite true. For we described, I think, a certain temperament which the souls of our guardians must possess, combining in a peculiar degree high spirit and thoughtfulness, that they might be able to show a due measure of mildness or sternness to friend or foe. Yes. And what of their training? Were they not to have been trained in gymnastic and music and all studies which are connected with these? Just so. And those who had undergone this discipline, we said, must not consider that they have any private property in gold or silver or anything else whatsoever, but as auxiliaries, drawing from those whom they preserved, so much pay in return for their protection as was sufficient for temperate men. They were to spend it in common and pass their lives in company with one another, devoting themselves perpetually to the pursuit of virtue and relieved from all other occupations. That also is the way it was put. Moreover, with regard to women, we observed that their nature must be brought into harmonious similarity with those of man, and that the same employments must be assigned to them all both in war and in their general mode of life. Yes, that was what we said. And what were our rules concerning the procreation of children? This, I think, is easy of recollection because of the novelty of our scheme. We ordained that the rights of marriage and of children should be common to all, to the end that no one should ever know his own offspring, but that each should look upon all his kindred regarding as sisters and brethren, all such as were between suitable limits of age, and those of the former and previous generations as parents and grandparents, and those after them as children and children's children. Yes, it is very easy to remember this too, as you describe it. Next, with a view to securing immediately the utmost possible perfection in their natures, do we not remember that it was incumbent on the rulers of both sexes to make provisions for the contraction of marriages by some secret mode of allotment, that to the good and bad separately might be allotted mates of their own kind, and so no ill feeling should arise among them, supposing as they would that chance govern the allotment? We remember that. And the offspring of the good, we said, must be word, while that of the bad was to be secretly dispersed among the other classes of the state. And continually observing them as they grew up, the rulers were to restore to their rank such as were worthy, and in the places of those so promoted substitute the unworthy in their own rank. Quite so. Have we now said enough for a summary recapitulation of yesterday's discourse? Or do we feel that anything is lacking, my dear Timaios, to our account? Not at all. You have exactly described what was said, Socrates. Listen, then, and I will tell you in the next place what I feel about the constitution which we described. My feeling is something like this. Suppose a man, on beholding beautiful creatures, whether the work of the painter or really alive, but at rest, should conceive a desire to see them in motion, to see them in motion and putting into active exercise the qualities which seemed to belong to their form. This is just what I feel about our city which we described. I would fain listen to one who depicted her engaged in a becoming manner with other countries in those struggles which cities must undergo, and going to war, and when at war showing a result worthy of her training and education, both when dealing in action and parleying in speech with other cities. Now, Critias and Hermocrates, my own verdict upon myself is that I should never be capable of celebrating the city and her people according to their merit. So far as concerns me, indeed, that is no marvel. But I have formed the same opinion about the poets, both past and present. Not that I disparage the poetic race, but anyone can see that the imitative tribe will most easily and perfectly imitate the surroundings amid which they have been brought up. But that which lies outside the range of each man's experience is hard to imitate correctly in actions and yet harder in words. As to the class of sophists, on the other hand, I have always held them to be well furnished with many fine discourses on other subjects. Yet I am afraid, seeing they wander from city to city, and have never had dwellings of their own to manage, they may somehow fall short in their conception of philosophers and statesmen, as to what in time of war and battles they would do and say in their dealings and converse with diverse people. One class then remains, those who share your habit of mind, having by nature and training a capacity for both philosophy and statecraft. Timaios, for instance, belonging to an admirable governed state, the Italian Locris, and one of the foremost of its citizens in wealth and birth, has filled offices of the highest authority and honor in his native city, and has also, in my judgment, climbed to the topmost peak of all philosophy, while at Athens we all know that Critias is no novice in any of the questions we are discussing. Of Hermocrates too we must believe on the evidence of many witnesses that his genius and his acquirements qualify him to deal with all such matters. This was in my mind yesterday when I willingly complied with your request that I should repeat the conversation concerning the ideal polity, for I knew that no man were more competent than you if you were willing to supply the sequel. No one else indeed at the present day could, after engaging our city in an honourable war, render her conduct worthy of her in all respects. So after saying all that was enjoined on me, I in my turn enjoined upon you the task of which I now remind you. Accordingly, you consulted together and agreed to entertain me at this time with a return feast of reason. I am here then ready for it in festal array, and never was there a more eager guest. Indeed, Socrates, as Timaios said, there will be no lack of zeal on our part, nor can we attempt to excuse ourselves from performing the task. In fact, yesterday, immediately on leaving this spot, when we reached the guest chamber at the house of Critias, where we are staying, and even before that, on our way thither, we were discussing this very matter. Critias then told us a story from an old tradition which you had better repeat now, Critias, to Socrates, that he may help us to judge whether it will answer the purpose for our present task or not. So be it. If our third partner Timaios agrees. I quite agree. Listen then, Socrates, to a tale which, strange though it be, is yet perfectly true, as Solon, the wisest of the seven, once affirmed. He was a relation and dear friend of Dropides, my grandfather, and he says himself in many passages of his poems. And Dropides told my grandfather Critias, who when advanced in life repeated it to us, that there were great and marvelous exploits achieved by Athens in days of old, which through lapse of time and the perishing of man have vanished from memory. And the greatest of all is one which it were fitting for us to narrate, and so at once discharge our debt of gratitude to you, and worthily and truly extol the goddess in this her festival by a kind of hymn in her honor. A good proposal. But what was this deed which Critias described on the authority of Solon as actually performed of old by this city, though unrecorded in history? I will tell an ancient story that I heard from a man no longer young, for Critias was then, as he said, hard upon 90 years of age, while I was about 10. It happened to be the children's day of the Apaturia, and then, as usual, the boys enjoyed their customary pastime, our fathers giving us prizes for reciting poetry. A great deal of poetry by various authors was recited, and since that of Solon was new at the time, many of us children sang his poems. So one of the clansmen said whether he really thought so or whether he wished to please Critias, he considered that Solon was not only in other respect the wisest of mankind, but also the noblest of all poets. The old man, how well I recollect it, was extremely pleased and said, smiling, "Yes, Aminandos, if he had not treated poetry merely as a bywork, but had made a serious business of it like the rest, and if he had finished the legend which he brought hither from Egypt, instead of being compelled to abandon it by the factions and other troubles which he found here on his return, my belief is that neither Hesiod nor Homer nor any other poet would have enjoyed greater fame than he." "What was the legend?" Critias asked Aminandos. "It concerned a mighty achievement," he replied, "and one that deserved to be the most famous in the world. A deed which our city actually performed, but owing to time and the destruction of the doers thereof, the story has not lasted to our times." "Tell us from the beginning," said the other, "what was the tale that Solon told, and how and from whom he heard it as true." "There's in Egypt," said Critias, "in the delta, at the apex of which the stream of the Nile divides, a province called the Saitic. And the chief city of this province is Sais, the birthplace of Amasis the king. The founder of the city is a goddess, whose name in the Egyptian tongue is Neith, and in Greek, as they aver, Athena. The people are great lovers of Athenians, and claim a certain kinship with our countrymen. Now when Solon traveled to this city, he said, he was most honorably entreated by the citizens. Moreover, when he questions concerning ancient things such of the priests as were most versed therein, he found that neither he nor any other Grecian man, one might well nigh say, knew aught about such matters. And once, when he wished to lead them on to talk of ancient times, he essayed to tell them of the oldest legend of Hellas, of Phoronios, who was called the first man, and of Niobe. And again he told the tale of Deucalion and Furia, how they survived after the deluge, and he reckoned up their descendants, and tried by calculating the periods to count up the number of years that passed during the events he related. Then said one of the priests, a man well stricken in years, "O Solon, Solon, ye Greek, are even children and old men, that is a Grecian, is there none?" And when Solon heard it, he said, What meanest thou by this? By this? And the priest said, Ye are all young in your souls, for ye have not in them, because of old tradition, any ancient belief nor knowledge that is hoary without. And the reason of it is this: many and manifold are the destructions of mankind, that have been and shall be. The greatest are by fire and by water, but besides these there are lesser ones in countless other fashions. For indeed that tale that is also told among you, how that Phaeton, the child of the sun, yoked his father's chariot, and for that he could not drive in his father's paths, he burnt up all things upon earth, and himself was smitten by a thunderbolt and slain. This story, as it is told, has the fashion of a fable. But the truth of it is a deviation of the bodies that move round the earth in the heavens, whereby comes at long intervals of time a destruction with much fire of the things that are upon earth. Thus do such as dwell on mountains and in high places and in dry perish more widely than they who live besides rivers and by the sea. Now the Nile, which is in all else our preserver, save us then also from this distress by releasing his founts. But when the gods sent a flood upon the earth, cleansing her with her waters, those in the mountains are saved, the neatherds and shepherds, but the inhabitants of the cities in your land are swept by the rivers into the sea. But in this country neither then nor at any time does water fall from on high upon the fields, but contrariwise all rises up by nature from below. Wherefore, and for which causes, the legends preserved here are the most ancient that are told. But the truth is that in all places where exceeding cold or heat does not forbid, there are ever human beings, now more, now fewer. Now, whether at Athens or in Egypt, or in any other place whereof we have tidings, anything noble or great or otherwise notable has occurred, we have all written down and preserved from ancient times in our temple here. But with you and other nations, the commonwealth has only just been enriched with letters and all else that cities require. And again, after the wonted term of years, like a recurring sickness, comes rushing on them the torrent from heaven, and it leaves only the unlettered and untaught among you, so that, as it were, ye become young again with a new birth, knowing not naught of what happened in the ancient times, either in our country or in yours. For instance, the genealogies, Solon, which you just now recounted concerning the people of your country, are little better than children tales. For in the first place, ye remember but one deluge, whereas there had been many before it. And moreover, ye know not that the fairest and noblest race among mankind lived once in your country, whence ye sprang all your city, which now is from a very little seed that of old was left over. Ye, however, know it, because the survivors lived and died for many generations without utterance in writing. For once upon a time, Solon, far beyond the greatest destruction by waters, that which is now the city of the Athenians was foremost both in war and in all besides, and her laws was exceedingly righteous above all cities. Her deeds and her government are said to have been the noblest among all under heaven, whereof the report has come to our ears. And Solon said that on hearing this he was astonished, and used all urgency in entreating the priests to relate him from beginning to end all about those ancient citizens. So the priest said, I grudge thee not, O Solon, and I will tell for thy sake, and for the sake of thy city, and chiefly for the honor of the goddess, who is the possessor, nurse, and instructress both of your city and of ours. For she founded yours earlier by 1,000 years, having taken the seed of you from earth, and Hephaestus, and ours in later time. And the date of our city's foundation is recorded in our sacred writings to be 8,000 years ago. But concerning the citizens of Athens, 9,000 years ago, I will inform you in brief of their laws and of the noblest of the deeds which they performed. The exact truth concerning everything we will examine in due order hereafter, taking the actual records at our leisure. Consider now their law in comparison with those of our country, for you will find here at the present day many examples of the laws which then existed among you. First, the separation of the priestly caste from the rest. Next, the distinction of the craftsmen, that each kind plies its own craft by itself and mingles not with another, and the class of shepherds and of hunters and of husbandmen are set apart, and that of the warriors too have surely notice is here sundered from all the other classes. For on them the law enjoins to study the art of war and naught else. Furthermore, there is the fashion of their arming with spears and shields, wherewith we have been the first men in Asia to arm ourselves. For the goddess taught this to us, as she did first to you in that country of yours. Again, as regards knowledge, you see how careful our law is in its first principles, investigating the laws of nature till it arrives at divination and medicine, the object of which is health, drawing from these divine studies lessons useful for human needs, and adding to these all the sciences that are connected there withal. With all this constitution and order, the goddess established you when she founded your nation first, choosing out the spot in which you were born, because she saw the mild temperament of its seasons would produce the highest intelligence in its people. Seeing then that the goddess was a lover of war and of wisdom, she selected a spot that should bring forth man likeness to herself, and therein she first founded your race. Thus then did you dwell, governed by such laws as I have described, I, and even better still, surpassing all men in excellence, as was meet for them that were offspring and nurslings of gods. Many and mighty are the deeds of your city recorded here for the marvel of man. But one is there which for greatness and nobleness surpasses all the rest. For our chronicles tell what a power your city quelled of old, that marched in wanton insolence upon all Europe and Asia together, issuing yonder from the Atlantic Ocean. For in those days the sea there could be crossed, since it had an island before the mouth of the strait, which is called, as you say, the Pillars of Hercules. Now this island was greater than Libya and Asia together, and therefrom there was passage for the seafarers of those times to the other islands, and from the islands to all the opposite continent which bounds that ocean truly named. For these regions that lie within the strait aforesaid seem to be but a bay having a narrow entrance, but the other is ocean verily, and the land surrounding it may with fullest truth and fitness be named a continent. In this island Atlantis arose, a great and marvelous might of kings ruling over all the island itself, and many other islands, and parts of the mainland, and besides these of the lands east of the strait they governed Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe to the borders of Etruria. So all this power gathered itself together, and your country and ours, and the whole region within the strait, it sought with one single swoop to enslave. Then, O Solon, did the power of your city shine forth in all men's eyes glorious in valor and in strength. For being foremost upon earth in courage and the arts of war, sometimes she was leader of the Hellenes, sometimes she stood alone, perforce, when the rest fell away from her. And after being brought into the uttermost perils, she vanquished the invaders and triumphed over them, and the nations that were not yet enslaved she preserved from slavery, while the rest of us who dwell this side, the pillars of Hercules, all did she set free with ungrudging hand. But in later time, after there had been exceeding great earthquakes and floods, there fell one day a night of destruction, and the warriors in your land, all in one body, were swallowed up by the earth, and in like manner did the island Atlantis sink beneath the sea and vanish away. Whereover to this day the ocean there is impassable and unsearchable, being blocked by very shallow shoals, which the island caused as she settled down. You have heard this brief statement, Socrates, of what the ancient Critias reported that he heard from Solon, and when you were speaking yesterday about the polity and the man whom you described, I was amazed, as I called to mind the story I have just told you, remarking how by some miraculous coincidence most of your account agreed unerringly with the description of Solon. I was unwilling, however, to say anything at the moment, for after so long a time my memory was at fault. I conceived thereof that I must not speak until I had thoroughly gone over the whole story by myself. Accordingly, I was quick to accept the task you imposed on us yesterday, thinking that for the most arduous part of all such undertakings, I mean supplying a story fitly corresponding to our intentions, we should be fairly well provided. So then, as Hermocrates said, as soon as ever I departed hence yesterday, I began to repeat the legends to our friends as I remembered, and when I got home I recovered nearly the whole of it by thinking it over at night. How true is the saying that what we learn in childhood has a wonderful hold on the memory. Of what I heard yesterday, I know not if I could call to mind the whole. But though it is so very long since I heard this tale, I should be surprised if a single point in it has escaped me. It was with much boyish delight that I listened at the time, and the old man was glad to instruct me, for I asked a great many questions, so that it is indelible fixed in my mind, like those encaustic pictures which cannot be effaced. And I narrated the story to the rest the first thing in the morning, that they might share my affluence of words. Now, therefore, to return to the object of all our conversation, I am ready to speak, Socrates, not only in general terms, but entering into details as I heard it. The citizens and the city which you yesterday described to us as in a fable we will transfer to the sphere of reality and to our own country, and we will suppose that ancient Athens is your ideal commonwealth, and say that the citizens whom you imagined are those veritable forefathers of ours whom the priests spoke. They will fit exactly, and there will be nothing discordant in saying that they were the men who lived in those days. And dividing the work between us, we will all endeavor to render an appropriate fulfillment of your injunctions. So you must consider, Socrates, whether the story of ours satisfies you, or whether we must look for another in its stead. How could we change it for the better, Critias? It is specially appropriate for this festival of the goddess, owing to its connection with her, while the fact that it is no fictitious tale, but a true history, is surely a great point. How shall we find other such citizens if we relinquish these? It cannot be, so with fortune's favour do you speak on, while I, in requital for my discourse of yesterday, have in my turn the privilege of listening in silence. Now consider, Socrates, how we proposed to distribute your entertainment. We resolved that Timaios, who is the best astronomer among us, and who has most of all made it his business to understand universal nature, should speak first, beginning with the origin of the universe, and should end with the birth of mankind, and that I should follow, receiving from him mankind brought to being in theory, and from you a portion of them exceptionally cultivated, and then that in accordance with Solon's laws, no less than with his statement, I should introduce them before our tribunal and make them our fellow citizens as being the Athenians of bygone days, whom the declaration of the sacred writings has delivered from their oblivion. And thenceforward we shall speak as if their claim to Athenian citizenship were fairly established. Ample and splendid indeed. It seems will be the banquet of discourse which I am to receive in my turn. So it would seem to be your business to speak next, Timaios, after you have duly invoked the gods. Yes, indeed, Socrates, that is what all do who possess the slightest share of judgment. At the outset of every work, great or small, they always call upon a god, and seeing that we are going to enter on a discussion of the universe, how far it is created or perchance uncreated, unless we are altogether beside ourselves, we must needs invoke the gods and goddesses, and pray above all that our discourse may be pleasing in their sight, next that it may be consistent with itself. Let it suffice, then, thus to have called upon the gods. But we must call upon ourselves likewise to conduct the discourse in such a way that you will most readily comprehend me, and I shall most fully carry out my intentions in expounding the subject that is before us. First, then, in my judgment, this distinction must be made. What is that which is eternally and has no becoming, and again, what is that which comes to be but is never? The one is comprehensible by thought with the aid of reason, ever changeless. The other, opinable by opinion with the aid of reasonless sensation, becoming and perishing, never truly existent. Now all that comes to be must needs be brought into being by some cause, for it is impossible for anything without a cause to attain to birth. Of whatsoever thing then the artificer, looking ever to the changeless and using that as his model, works out the design and function, all that is so accomplished must needs be fair. But if he look to that which has come to be, using the created as his model, the work is not fair. Now as the whole heaven or order of the universe, for whatsoever name is most acceptable to it, be it so named by us, we must first ask concerning it the question which lies at the outset of every inquiry. Whether did it exist eternally, having no beginning of generation, or has it come into being starting from some beginning? It has come into being, for it can be seen and felt and has body. And all such things are sensible, and sensible things apprehensibly by opinion with sensation belong, as we saw, to becoming and creation. We say that what has come to be must be brought into being by some cause. Now, the maker and father of this all, it were a hard task to find, and having found him, it were impossible to declare him to all men. However, we must again inquire concerning him, after which of the models did the framer of it fashion the universe, after the changeless and abiding, or after that which has come into being? If now this universe is fair, and its artificer God, it is plain that he looked to the eternal. But if, nay, it may not even be uttered without impiety, then it was to that which has come into being. Now it is manifest to everyone that he looked to the eternal, for the universe is fairest of all things that have come to be, and he is the most excellent of causes. And having come on this wise into being, it has been created in the image of that which is comprehensible by reason and wisdom and changes never. Granting this, it must needs be that this universe is a likeness of something. Now it is all important to make our beginning according to nature, and this affirmation must be laid down with regard to a likeness and its model, that the words must be akin to the subjects of which they are the interpreters. Therefore, of that which is abiding and sure and discoverable by the aid of reason, the words too must be abiding and unchanging, in so far as it lies in words to be incontrovertible and immovable. They must in no wise fall short of this. But those which deal with that which is made in the image of the former, and which is a likeness, must be likely and dully corresponding with their subject. As being is to becoming, so is truth to believe. If then, Socrates, after so many men have said diverse things concerning the gods and the generation of the universe, we should not prove able to render an account everywhere and in all respects consistent and accurate, let no one be surprised. But if we can produce one as probable as any other, we must be content, remembering that I who speak and you, my judges, are but men, so that on these subjects we should be satisfied with the probable story and seek nothing further. Quite right, Timaios. We must accept it exactly as you say. Your preclude is exceedingly welcome to us, so please proceed with the strain itself. Let us declare then for what cause nature and this all was framed by him that framed it. He was good, and in none that is good can there arise jealousy of aught at any time. So being far aloof from this, he desired that all things should be as like unto himself as possible. This is that most sovereign cause of nature and the universe, which we shall most surely be right in accepting from man of understanding. For God, desiring that all things should be good, and that, so far as this might be, there should be naught evil, having received all that is visible, not in a state of rest, but moving without harmony or measure, brought it from its disorder into order, thinking that this was in all ways better than the other. Now it neither has been nor is permitted to the most perfect to do aught but what is most fair. Therefore he took thought and perceived that of all things which are by nature visible, no work that is without reason will ever be fairer than that which has reason, setting whole against whole, and that without soul reason cannot dwell in anything. Because then he argued thus, in forming the universe he created reason and soul in body, that he might be the maker of a work that was by nature most fair and perfect. In this way then we ought to affirm according to the probable account that this universe is a living creature, in very truth possessing soul and reason by the providence of God. Having attained thus far, we must go on to tell what follows, after the similitude of what animal its framer fashioned it. To none of these, which naturally belong to the class of the partial, must we deign to liken it, for nothing that is like to the imperfect could ever become fair, but that of which the other animals severally and in their kinds are portions to this above all things, we must declare that the universe is most like. for that comprehends and contains in itself all ideal animals, even as this universe contains us and all other creatures that have been formed to be visible. For since God desired to liken it most nearly to what is fairest of the objects of reason, and in all respects perfect, he made it a single visible living being, containing within itself all animals that are by nature akin to it. Are we right then in affirming the universe to be one, or had it be more true to speak of a great and boundless number? One, it must be, if it is to be created according to its pattern. For that which comprehends all ideal animals that could never be a second in company of another. For there must again exist another animal comprehending them, whereof the two would be parts, and no longer to them, but to that which comprehended them. Should we more truly affirm the universe to have been likened? To the end, then, that in its solitude this universe might be like the all perfect animal, the Maker made neither two universes nor an infinite number, but as it has come into being, this universe one and only begotten, so it is and shall be forever. Now that which came into being must be material, and such as can be seen and touched. Apart from fire, nothing could ever become visible, nor without something solid could it be tangible, and solid cannot exist without earth. Therefore did God, when he set about to frame the body of the universe, form it of fire and of earth. But it is not possible for two things to be fairly united without a third. For they need a bond between them which shall join them both. The best of bonds is that which makes itself, and those which it binds, as complete a unity as possible. And the nature of proportion is to accomplish this most perfectly. For when of any three numbers, whether expressing three or two dimensions, one is a mean term, so that as the first is to the middle, so is the middle to the last, and conversely as the last is to the middle, so is the middle to the first, then since the middle becomes first and the last and the first both become middle, of necessity all will come to be the same, and being the same with one another, all will be a unity. Now, if the body of the universe were to have been made a plain surface, having no thickness, one mean would have sufficed to unify itself to the extremes. But now, since it behoved it to be solid, and since solids can never be united by one mean, but require two, God accordingly set air and water betwixt fire and earth, and making them as far as possible exactly proportional, so that fire is to air as air to water, and as air is to water, water is to earth. Thus he compacted and constructed a universe visible and tangible. For these reasons, and out of these elements of this kind, four in number, the body of the universe was created, being brought into concord through proportion. And from these it derived friendship, so that coming to unity with itself, it became indissoluble by any force save the will of him who joined it. Now the making of the universe took up the whole bulk of each of these four elements. Of all fire and all water and air and earth, its framer fashioned it, leaving over no part nor power without. Therein he had this intent. First, that it might be a creature perfect to the utmost with all its parts perfect. Next, that it might be one seeing that nothing was left over whereof another should be formed. Furthermore, that it might be free from age and sickness, for he reflected that when hot things and cold, and all such as have strong powers gather round a composite body from without and fall unseasonably upon it, they undermine it and bring upon it sickness, and age cause its decay. For such motives and reasons he fashioned it as one whole, which each of its parts whole in itself, so as to be perfect and free from age and sickness. And he assigned to it its proper and natural shape. To that which is to comprehend all animals in itself, that shape seems proper, which comprehends in itself all shapes that are. Whereof he turned it off a rounded and spherical shape, having its bounding surface in all points at an equal distance from the centre. This being the most perfect and regular shape, for he thought that a regular shape was infinitely fairer than an irregular, and all round about he finished of the outer surface perfectly smooth, for many reasons. It needed not eyes for naught visible was left outside, nor hearing, for there was nothing to hear, and there was no surrounding air which made breathing needful. Nor must it have any organ whereby it should receive into itself its sustenance, and again reject that which was already digested. For nothing went forth of it nor entered in from anywhere, for there was nothing. For by design was it created to supply its own sustenance, but its own wasting, and to have all its action and passion in itself by itself. For its framer deemed that were itself sufficing, it would be far better than if it required aught else. And hence, wherewith it had no need to grasp aught, nor to defend itself against another, he thought not fit idly to bestow upon it, nor yet feed, nor in a word anything to serve as the means of movement. For he assigned it that motion which was proper to its bodily form, of all the seven, that which must belongs to reason and intelligence, whereof turning it about uniformly in the same spot on its own axis, he bade it to revolve round and round. But all the six motions he took away from it and left it without part in their wanderings. And since for this revolution there was no need of feet, he made it without legs and without feet. So the universal design of the ever-living God that he planned for the God that was some time to be made its surface smooth and even everywhere equally distant from the center, a body whole and perfect out of the perfect bodies. And God set soul in the midst thereof, and spread her through all its body, and even wrapped the body about with her from without, and he made it a sphere in a circle, revolving a universe, one and alone. But for its excellence, it was able to be company to itself, and needed no other, being sufficient for itself as acquaintance and friend. For all these things then he created it a happy God. But the soul was not made by God younger than the body, even as she comes later in his account, we are essaying to give. For he would not, when he had joined them together, have suffered the elder to be governed by the younger. But we are far too prone to a causal and random habit of mind, which shows itself in our speech. God made soul in birth and in excellence, early and elder than body, to be its mistress and governor, and he framed her out of the following elements and in the following way. From the undivided and ever-changeless substance, and that which becomes divided in material bodies, of both these he mingled in the third place the form of essence in the midst between the same and the other. And this he composed on such wise between the undivided and that which is in material bodies divided, and taking them in three number, he blended them into one form, forcing the nature of the other, hard as it was to mingle, into union with the same, and mingling them with essence, and of the three making one, again he divided this into as many parts as was meet, each part mingled of same and of other and of essence. And he began his dividing thus. First he took one portion from the whole, then he went on to take a portion double of this, and the third half as much again as the second, and triple of the first, the fourth double of the second, the fifth 3 times the third, the sixth 8 times the first, the seventh 27 times the first. After that he filled up the interval between the powers of 2, of 3 by severing yet more from the original mass, and placing it between them in such a manner that within each interval were 2 means, the first exceeding one extreme in the same proportion as it was exceeded by the other, the second by the same number exceeding the one as it was exceeded by the other. And whereas by these links there were formed in the original intervals new intervals of 3 seconds, 4 thirds, and 9/8, he went on to fill up all the intervals of 4 thirds with what of 9/8, leaving in each a fraction over. And the terms of the interval forming this fraction are in the numerical proportion of 256 to 243. By this time the mixture whence he cut off this portion was all used up. Next he cleft the structure so formed lengthwise into 2 halves, and laying the 2 so as to meet in the center in the shape of the letter X, he bent them into a circle and joined them, causing them to meet themselves and each other at a point opposite to that of their original contact. And he comprehended them in the motion that revolves uniformly on the same axis, and one of the circles he made exterior and one interior. The exterior motion he named the motion of the same, the interior that of the other, and the circle of the same he made revolve to the right by way of the side, that of the other to the left by way of the diagonal. And he gave the supremacy to the motion of the same and the uniform. For he left that single and undivided, but the inner circle he cleft into 7 unequal circles in the proportion of the double and triple intervals severally, each being 3 in number. And he appointed that the circles should move in opposite directions, 3 at the same speed, the other 4 differing in speed from the 3 and among themselves, yet moving in a due ratio. Now after the framing of the soul was finished to the mind of him that framed her, next he fashioned within her all that is bodily, and he drew them together and fitted them middle to middle. And from the midst even unto the ends of heaven she was woven everywhere and encompassed it and round from without. And having her movement in herself, she began a divine beginning of endless and reasonable life for ever and evermore. Now the body of the universe has been created visible, but she is invisible, and she, even soul, has part in reason and in harmony. And where she is made by the best of all, whereunto belong reason and eternal being, so she is the best of all that is brought into being. Therefore, since she is formed of the nature of same and of other and of being, of these 3 portions blended, in due proportion divided and bound together, and turns about and returns into herself, whenever she touches aught that has manifold existence or aught that has undivided, she is steered through all her substance, and she tells that wherewith the thing is same, and that wherefrom it is different, and in what relation or place or manner or time it comes to pass both in the region of the changing and in the region of the changeless, that each thing affects another and is affected. This word of here is true alike, whether it deals with same or with other, without voice or sound in the self-moved arising. And when she is busied with the sensible, and the circle of the other being true announces it throughout all the soul, then are formed true opinions and true beliefs. And when she is busy with the rational, and the circle of the same declares it running smoothly, then reason and knowledge cannot but be made perfect. And in whatsoever existing thing these 2 are found, if a man affirm it is aught but soul, what he says will be anything rather than the truth. And when the Father who begat it perceived the created image of the eternal gods, that it had motion and life, he rejoiced and was well pleased, and he bethought him to make it yet more nearly like its pattern. Now whereas that is a living being eternally existent, even so he essayed to make this all the like to the best of his power. Now so it was that the nature of the ideal was eternal, but to bestow this attribute altogether upon a created thing was impossible. So he bethought him to make a moving image of eternity, and while he was ordering the universe, he made of eternity that abides in unity an eternal image moving according to number, even that which we have named time. For whereas days and nights and months and years were not before the universe was created, he then devised the generation of them along with the fashioning of the universe. Now all these are portion of time, and was and shall be are forms of time that have come to be, although we wrongly ascribe them unawares to the eternal essence. For we say that it was and is and shall be, but in verity is alone belongs to it, and was and shall be, it is meet should be applied only to becoming, which moves in time, for these are motions. But that which is ever changeless without motion must not become elder or younger in time, neither must it have become so in the past, nor be so in the future, nor has it to do with any attributes that becoming attaches to the moving object of sense. These have come into being as forms of time, which is the image of eternity and revolves according to number. Moreover, we say that the become is the become, and the becoming is the becoming, and that which shall become is that which shall become. And not being is not being. In all this we speak incorrectly, but concerning the things the present were perchance not the right season to inquire particularly. Time then has come into being along with the universe, that being generated together they may be dissolved. Should be a dissolution of them ever come to pass, and it was made after the pattern of the eternal nature, that it might be as like to it as was possible. For the pattern is existent for all eternity, but the copy has been and is and shall be throughout all time continually. So then, this was the plan and intent of God for the generation of time. The sun and the moon and 5 other stars, which have the name of planets, have been created for defining and preserving the numbers of time. And when God had made their several bodies, he set them in the orbits wherein the revolution of the other was moving in 7 circles, 7 stars. The moon he placed in that nearest the earth, and in the second above the earth he set the sun. And the morning star and that which is held sacred to Hermes he assigned to those that moved in an orbit having equal speed with the sun, but having a contrary tendency. Wherefore the sun and Hermes and the morning star in like manner overtake and are overtaken one by another. And as to the rest, were we to set forth all the orbits wherein he put them, and the causes wherefore he did so, the account, though only by the way, would lay on us a heavier task than that which was our chief object in giving it. These things perhaps may hereafter, when we have leisure, find a fitting exposition. But when each of the beings which were to join in creating time had arrived in its proper orbit and had been generated as animate creatures, their bodies secured with living bonds, and had learned their appointed task, then in the motion of the other, which was slanting and crossed the motion of the same, and was thereby controlled, whereas one of these planets had a larger, another a smaller circuit, the lesser orbit was completed more swiftly, the larger more slowly. But because of the motion of the same, those which revolved most swiftly seemed to be overtaken by those that went more slowly, though really they overtook them. For the motion of the same, twisting all their circles into spirals, because they have a separate and simultaneous motion in the opposite way, being of all the swiftest displaced closest to itself that which departs most slowly from it, and that there might be some clear measure of the relative swiftness and slowness with which they moved in their 8 revolutions. God kindled a light in the second orbit from the earth, which you now have named the sun, in order that it might shine most brightly to the ends of heaven, and that living things, so many as we meet, should possess number, learning it from the motion of the same and uniform. Night then and day have been created in this manner for these causes, and this is one revolution of the undivided and most intelligent circuit. And a month is fulfilled when the moon, after completing her own orbit, overtakes the sun, a year when the sun has completed its own course. But the course of the others man have not taken into account save a few out of many, and they neither give them names nor measure them against one another, comparing them by means of numbers. Nay, I may say, they do not know that time arises from the wanderings of these, which are incalculable in multitude and marvelously intricate. Nonetheless, however, can we observe that the perfect number of time fulfills the perfect year at the moment when the relative swiftness of all the 8 revolutions accomplish their course together and reach their starting point, being measured by the circle of the same and uniformly moving. In this way, then, and for these courses, we were created all such of the stars as wander through the heavens in turn about therein, in order that its universe may be most like to the perfect and ideal animal by its assimilation to the eternal being. Now up to the generation of time, all else had been accomplished in the likeness of that whereunto it was likened, but in that it did not yet contain all living creatures created within it. Herein it was still unlike. So he went on to complete this that remained unfinished, molding it after the nature of the pattern. So many forms, then, as mind perceived to exist in the ideal animal according to their variety and multitude, such kinds and such a number did he think fit that this universe should possess. There are 4-fold. First, the waste of the heavenly gods. Next, the winged tribe, whose path is in the air. Third, whatso dwells in the water. And fourth, that which goes upon dry land. The visible form of the deities he created chiefly of fire, that it might be most radiant and most fair to behold, enlightening it to the all. He shaped it like a sphere and assigned it to the intelligence of the Supreme to follow after it, and he disposed it throughout all the firmament of heaven to be an adornment of it in very truth, wrought cunningly over the whole expanse. And he bestowed 2 movements upon each one in the same spot and uniform, whereby it should be ever constant to its own thoughts concerning the same thing. The other forward, but controlled by the revolution of the same and uniform. But for the other 5 movements he made it motionless, and still, that each star might attain the highest completeness of perfection. From which cause have been created all the stars that wander, not but abide fast for ever, living beings divine and eternal, and in one spot revolving, while those that move in a circle and wander, as aforesaid, have come into being on those principles which in the foregoing we have declared. And the earth, our foster mother, that is globed round the axis stretched from pole to pole of the universe, her he fashioned to be the guardian and creator of night and day, the first and most august of the gods that have been created within the heavens. But the circlings of them, and their crossings one of another, and the manner of the returning of their orbits upon themselves and their approximations, and which of the deities meet in their conjunctions, and which are in opposition, and how they pass before and behind each other, and at what times they are hidden from us, and again reappearing, sent to them who cannot calculate their motions, panics, and portents of things to come, to declare all this without visible illustrations of their very movements were labor lost. So let thus much suffice on this head, and let our exposition concerning the nature of the gods visible and created be brought to an end. But concerning the other divinities, to declare and determine their generation were a task too mighty for us. Therefore we must trust in those who have revealed it herefore, seeing that they are offspring, as they said, of gods, and without doubt know their own forefathers. We cannot then mistrust the children of gods, though they speak without probable or inevitable demonstrations. But since they profess to announce what pertains to their own kindred, we must conform to usage and believe them. Let us then accept on their word this account of the generation of these gods. Of earth and heaven were born children, Oceanus and Thetis, of these Porcis and Kronos and Rhea, and all their brethren, and of Kronos and Rhea, Zeus and Hera, and all whom we know to be called their brothers, and they in turn had children after them. Now when all the gods had come to birth, both those who evolve before our eyes, and those who reveal themselves insofar as they will, he who begat this universe spake to them these words: Gods of gods, whose creator am I, and father of works, which by me coming into being are indissoluble, save by my will. Behold, all which have been fastened may be loosed yet to loose that which is well fitted, and in good case were the will of an evil one. Wherefore, forasmuch as ye have come into being, immortal you are not, nor indissoluble altogether. Nevertheless shall ye not be loosed, nor meet with the doom of death, having found in my will a bond yet mightier and more sovereign than those that you were bound withal when you came into being. Now therefore hearken to the word that I declare unto you. 3 kinds of mortal beings are yet uncreated. And if these be not created, the heaven will be imperfect, for it will not have within it all kinds of living things. Yet these it must have, if it is to be perfect. But if these were created by my hands, and from me received their life, they would be equal to gods. Therefore, in order that they may be mortal, and that this all may be truly all, turn ye according to nature unto the creation of living things, imitating my power that was put forth in the generation of you. Now such part of them as is worthy to share the name of the immortals, which is called divine, and governs in the souls of those that are willing ever to follow after justice, and after you, this I, having sown and provided it, will deliver unto you, and ye for the rest, weaving the mortal with the immortal, shall create living beings, and bring them to birth, and giving them sustenance, shall ye increase them, and when they perish, receive them back again. Thus spake he, and again into the same bowl wherein he mingled and blended the universal soul, he poured what was left of the former, mingling it somewhat after the same manner, yet no longer so pure as before, but second and third in pureness. And when he had compounded the whole, he portioned of souls equal in number to the stars, and distributed a soul to each star, and setting them into the stars as though in a chariot, he showed them the nature of the universe and declared to them its fated laws. How that the first incarnation should be ordained to be the same for all, that none might suffer disadvantage as at his hands, and how they must be sown into the instruments of time, each into that which was meet for it, and be born as the most God fearing of all living creatures. And whereas human nature was twofold, the stronger was that race which should hereafter be called man. When therefore they should be of necessity implanted in bodily forms, and of their bodies something should ever be coming in and other passing away. In the first place, they must needs all have innate one, and the same faculty of sense arising from forcible affections. Next, love mingled with pleasure and pain, and besides these fear and wrath, and all the feelings that accompany these and such, and as are of the contrary nature. And should they master these passions, they would live in righteousness, if otherwise in unrighteousness. And he who lived well throughout his allotted time should be conveyed once more to a habitation in his kindred star, and there should enjoy a blissful and congenial life. But failing of this, he should pass in the second incarnation into the nature of a woman, and if in this condition he still would not turn from the evil of his ways, then according to the manner of his wickedness, he should ever be changed into the nature of some beast in such form of incarnation as fitted his disposition, and should not rest from the weariness of these transformations until by following the revolution that is within him of the same and uniform, he should overcome by reason all that burden that afterwards clung around him of fire and water and air and earth, a troublous and senseless mass, and should return once more to the form of his first and best nature. And when he had ordained all these things for them to the end that he might be guiltless of all the evil that should be in each of them, God sowed some in the earth, some in the moon, and some in the other instruments of time. And what came after the sowing he gave into the hands of the young gods to mold mortal bodies, and having wrought all the residue of human soul that needed yet to be added to govern and guide as nobly and perfectly as they could the mortal creature, in so far as it brought not evil upon its own head. So when he had made all these ordinances for him, God was abiding after the manner of his own nature. And as he so abode, the children, thinking on the command of their father, were obedient to it, and having received the immortal principle of a mortal creature, imitating their own artificer, they borrowed from the universe portions of fire and of earth and of water and of air, on condition that they should be returned again, and they cemented together what they took, not with the indissoluble bonds wherewith all they themselves were held together, but welding it with many rivets, invisible for smallness, and making of all the elements one body for each creature, they confined the revolutions of the immortal souls in a body inflowing and outflowing continually. And they, being confined in a great river, neither controlled it nor were controlled, but bore and were borne violently to and fro, so that the whole creature moved, but advanced at random without order or method, having all the six motions, for they moved forward and backward, and again to right and to left, and downward and upward, and in every way went straying in the six directions. For great as was the tide sweeping over them and flowing off, which brought them sustenance, a yet greater tumult was caused by the effects of the bodies that struck against them, as when the body of anyone came into contact with some alien fire that met it from without, or with solid earth, or with liquid glidings of water, or if he were caught in the tempest of winds borne on the air, and so the motions from all these elements rushing through the body penetrated to the soul. This is, in fact, the reason why these have all alike been called and still are called sensations, aesthesis. Then too did they produce the most wide and vehement agitation for the time being, joining with the perpetually streaming current and steering and violently shaking the revolutions of the soul, so that they altogether hindered the circle of the same by flowing contrary to it, and they stopped it from governing and from going, while the circle of the other they displaced, so that the double and triple intervals, being three of each sort, and the means of junctures of three seconds and 4/3 and 9/8, since they could not be utterly undone, save by him that joined them, were forced by them to turn in all kinds of ways, and to admit all manner of breaking and twisting of the circles in every possible form, so that they can barely hold to one another, and though they are in motion, it is motion without law, sometimes reversed, now slanting, and now inverted. It is as though a man should stand on his head, resting it on the earth, and supporting his feet against something aloft. In this case, the man in such condition and the spectators would reciprocally see right and left reversed in the persons of each other. The same and similar effects are produced with great intensity in the soul's revolutions, and when from external objects there meets them anything that belongs to the class of the same or to that of the other, then they declare its relative sameness or difference quite contrariwise to the truth, and show themselves false and irrational, and no circuit is governor or leader in them at that time. And whenever sensations from without rushing up and falling upon them drag along with them the whole vessel of the soul, then the circuits seem to govern, though they really are governed. On account then of all these experiences, the soul is at first bereft of reason, now as in the beginning, when she is confined in a mortal body. But when the stream of growth and nutriment flows in with smaller volume, and the revolutions calming down go their own way and become settled as time passes on, then the orbits are reduced to the form that belongs to the several circles in their natural motion, and declaring accurately the other and the same, they set their possessor in the way to become rational. And if any just discipline or of education help this process, he becomes whole altogether without a blemish, having made his escape from the most grievous of plagues. But if he neglect it, he passes the days of his life halt and maimed, and unhallowed and unreasonable he comes again to Hades. These things, however, belong to a later time. We must discuss more exactly the subject immediately before us. And as to the matters which are previous to this, concerning the generation of the body in all its parts, and concerning soul, and the reasons and designs of the gods, whereby they have come into being, we must cling to the most probable theory, and by proceeding in this way, so give an account of all. Imitating the shape of the universe, which was spherical, they confined the two divine revolutions in a globe-shaped body, the same that we now call the head, which is the divinest part of us and has dominion over all our members. To this the gods gave the whole body, when they had put it together to minister to it, reflecting that it possessed all the motions that should be, in order then that it might not have to roll upon the earth, which has hills and hollows of all kinds, nor be at a loss to surmount the one and climb out of the other. They gave it the body for convenience and for ease of going, whence the body was endowed with length and grew for limbs that could be stretched and bent, which the god devised for it to go withal, and by means of which, clinging and supporting itself, it is enabled to pass through every place, bearing at the top of us the habitation of the most divine and sacred element. In this way, then, and for these reasons, were legs and hands added to all mankind, and the gods, deeming that the front was more honorable than the back, and more fit to lead, made us to move for the most part in this direction. So it behooved man to have the front part distinguished and unlike the back. Therefore, having set the face upon the globe of the head, on that side they attached it to its organs for all the forethought of the soul, and they ordained this which had the faculty of guidance should be by nature the front. And first of the organs they wrought light-giving eyes, which they fixed there on the plan I shall explain. Such sort of fire as had the property of yielding a gentle light, but not of burning, they contrived to form into a substance akin to the light of every day. The fire within us, which is akin to the daylight they made to flow pure, smooth, and dense through the eyes, having made close to the whole fabric of the eyes, and especially the pupils, so that they kept back all that was coarser and suffered only this to filter through unmixed and pure. Whenever then there is daylight surrounding the current of vision, then this issues forth as like into like, and coalescing with the light is formed into one uniform substance in the direct line of vision wherever the stream issuing from within strikes upon some external object that falls in its way. So the whole from its uniformity becomes sympathetic. And whenever it comes in contact with anything else or anything with it, it passes on the motions thereof over the whole body until they reach the soul, and thus causes that sensation which we call seeing. But when its kindred fire departs into night, the visual current is cut off. For issuing into an alien element, it is itself changed and quenched, having no longer a common nature with the surrounding air, which has in it no fire. Therefore it ceases from seeing and moreover becomes an allurement to sleep. For the gods had devised as a safeguard of the sight the structures of the eyelids. And when these are closed, they shut up the force of fire within. And this smoothes and calms the motions within. And when these are calmed, quiet ensues. And if the quiet is profound sleep, with few dreams falls on us. But if some of the stronger motions are left according to their nature and the places where they remain, they engender visions corresponding in kind and in number, which are images within us, and when we awake are remembered as outside us. Now the explanation of reflections in mirrors and all bright smooth surfaces is no longer hard to discern, for because of the communion of the internal and external fire which again is united on the smooth surface and in manifold ways deflected, all these reflections take place, the fire that belongs to the face coalescing with the fire of the visual current upon the surface of the smooth bright object. And left appears right and right left, because mutually opposite particles of the visual current and of the object seen come into contact, contrary to the wanted mode of collision. On the other hand, right appears as right and left as left, when the act of combination with that wherewith it combines, the ray changes sides. This happens when the smooth surface of the mirror is curved upwards on each side and so throws the right portion of the visual current to the left side and the converse. But if it is turned lengthwise to the face, it makes the same reflection appear completely upside down, thrusting the lower portion of the way to the upper end and the upper to the lower. All these things are among the secondary causes which God uses to serve him in carrying out the idea of the best so far as is possible. But the multitude regard them not as secondary but as primary causes which act by cooling and heating, condensing and rarefying, and all such processes. Yet they are incapable of all reason or thought for any purpose. For the only existing thing to which belongs the possession of reason we must affirm to be soul. And this is invisible, whereas fire and water and air and earth are all visible creations. Now the lover of reasons and knowledge must first seek for the causes which belong to the rational order, and only in the second place those which belong to the class of things which are moved by others and move others in turn. This then is what we must also do. We must declare both classes of causes, distinguishing between those which with the aid of reason are the creators of fair things and good, and those which, being destitute of reason, produce from time to time chance effects without design. Enough then of the auxiliary causes which combine in giving the eyes the power they now possess, but the great result for the sake of which God bestowed them on us must be our next theme. Sight, according to my judgment, has been the cause of the greatest blessing to us, inasmuch as of our present discourse concerning the universe not one word would have been uttered had we never seen the stars and the sun and the heavens. But now day and night, being seen of us in months, and the revolution of the years have created number, and they gave us the notion of time and the power of searching into the nature of the all. Whence we have derived philosophy, than which no greater good has come, neither shall come hereafter as the gift of heaven to mortal man. This I declare to be the chiefest blessing due to the eyes. On the west that are meaner, why should we descend? Let him who loves not wisdom, if he be blinded of these lament with idle moan. But on our part, let this be affirmed to be the cause of vision for these ends. God discovered and bestowed sight upon us in order that we might observe the orbits of reason which are in heaven and make use of them for the revolutions of thought in our own souls, which are keen to them, the trouble to the serene, and that learning them and acquiring natural truth of reasoning, we might imitate the divine movements that are ever unerring and bring into order those within us which are all astray. And of sound and hearing again the same account must be given. To the same ends and with the same intent they have been bestowed on us by the gods. For not only has speech been appointed for the same purpose, whereto it contributes the largest share, but all such music as is expressed in sound has been granted for the sake of harmony. And harmony, having her motions akin to the revolutions in our own souls, has been bestowed by the muses on him who with reason seeks their help, not for any senseless pleasure, such as is now supposed to be its chiefest use, but as an ally against the discord which has grown up in the revolution of our soul, to bring her into order and into unison with herself, and with them too, because our habit of mind is mostly so faulty of measure and lacking in grace, is a secure bestowed on us by the same givers for the same ends. Now in our foregoing discourse, with few exceptions, we have been declaring the creations wrought through mind. We must now set by their side those things which come into being through necessity, for the generation of this universe was a mixed creation by a combination of necessity and reason, and whereas reason governed necessity by persuading her to guide the greatest part of created things to the best end, on such conditions and principles, through necessity overcome by reasonable persuasion, this universe was fashioned in the beginning. If then we would really declare its creation in the manner whereby it has come to be, we must add also the nature of the errant cause and its moving power. Thus then, let us return upon our steps, and when we have found a second fitting cause for the things aforesaid, let us once more, proceeding in the present case as we did in the former, begin over again from the beginning. Now we must examine what came before the creation of the heavens, the very origin of fire and water and air and earth, and the conditions that were before them. For now no one has declared the manner of their generation, but we speak as if man knew what is fire and each of the others, and we treat them as beginnings, as elements of the whole, whereas by one who has ever so little intelligence, they could not plausibly be represented as belonging even to the class of syllables. Now, however, let our say thus be said, the first principle or principles, or whatever we may hold it to be which underlies all things, we must not declare at present for no other reason but that it is difficult according to the present method of our exposition to make clear our opinion. You must not then deem that I ought to discourse of this, nor could I persuade myself that I should be right in essaying so mighty a task. But holding fast the principle we laid down at the outset, the value of a probable account, I will strive to give an explanation that is no less probable than another, but more so, returning back to describe from the beginning each and all things. So now again, at the outset of our quest, let us call upon God to pilot us safe through a strange and unfamiliar discourse to the heaven of probability. And thus let us begin once more. Our new exposition of the universe then must be founded on a fuller classification than the former. Then we distinguish two forms, but now a third kind must be disclosed. The two were indeed enough for our former discussion when we laid down one form as the pattern, intelligible and changeless, the second as copy of the pattern, which comes into being and is visible. A third we did not then distinguish, deeming that two would suffice. But now it seems by constraint of our discourse we must try to express and make manifest a form obscure and dim. What power then must we conceive that nature has given it? Something like this. It is the receptacle and, as it were, the nurse of all becoming. This saying is true, but we must put it in clearer language, and this is hard, especially as for the sake of it we must needs inquire into fire and the substances that rank with fire. For it is hard to say which of all these we ought to call water any more than fire, or indeed which we ought to call by any given name, rather than all and each severally, in such a way as to employ any truthful and trustworthy mode of speech. How then are we to deal with this point? And what is the question that we should properly raise concerning it? In the first place, what we now have named water, by condensation, as we suppose, we see turning to stones and earth, and by rarefying and expanding, this same element becomes wind and air, when inflamed, becomes fire, and conversely, fire contracted and quenched returns again to the form of air. Also, air concentrating and condensing becomes cloud and mist, and from these yet further compressed comes flowing water, and from water earth and stones once more. And so it appears they hand on one and to another the cycle of generation. Thus, then, since these several bodies never assume one constant form, which of them can we positively affirm to be really this, and not another without being shamed in our own eyes? It cannot be. It is far the safest course when we make a statement concerning them to speak as follows. What we see in process of perpetual transmutation, as for instance fire, we must not call this, but such like, is the appellation we must confer on fire. Nor must we call water this, but always such. Nor must we apply to anything as if it had any stability such predicates as we express by the use of the term this and that, and suppose that we signify something thereby. For it flees, and will not abide such terms as this and that, and relative to this, and every phrase which represent it as stable. The word this we must not use of any of them, but such, applying the same sense to all their mutations, we must predicate of each and all. Fire we must call that which universally that has that appearance, and so must we name all things such as come into being, that wherein they come to be severally, and show themselves, and from whence again they perish. In naming that alone must we use the word that and this, but whatever has any quality such as white or hot, or any of two opposites attributes, and all combinations of these we must denote by no such term. But we must try to speak yet more clearly on this matter. Suppose a man, having molded all kinds of figures out of gold, should unceasingly remold them, interchanging them all with one another. It were much the safest thing in view of truth to say that it is gold. But as to the triangles, or any other shapes that were impressed on it, never to speak of them as existing, seeing that they change, even as we are in the act of defining them. But if it will admit the term such with any tolerable security, we must be content. The same language must be applied to the nature which receives into it all material things. We must call it always the same, for it never departs from its own function at all. It ever receives all things into, and has nowhere any form in any wise like to aught of the shapes that enter into it. For it is as the substance wherein all things are naturally molded, being steered and informed by the entering shapes. And owing to them it appears different from time to time, but the shapes which pass in and out are likenesses of the eternal existences, being copied from them in a fashion wondrous and hard to declare, which we will follow up later on. For the present, however, we must conceive three kinds. First, that which comes to be. Secondly, that wherein it comes to be. Third, that from which the becoming is copied when it is created. And we may liken the recipient to a mother, the model to a father, and that which is between them to a child. And we must remember that if a molded copy is to present to view all varieties of form, the matter in which it is molded cannot be rightly prepared unless it be entirely bereft of all those forms which it is about to receive from without. For were it like any one of the entering shapes, whenever that of an opposite or entirely different nature came upon it, it would in receiving it give the impression badly intruding its own form. Wherefore that which shall receive all forms within itself must usually without share in any of the forms. Just as in the making of sweet unguents, man purposely contrive as the beginning of the work to make the fluids that are to receive the perfumes perfectly scentless. And those who set about molding figures in any soft substance do not suffer any shape to show itself therein at the beginning, but they first knead it smooth and make it as uniform as they can. In the same way it behooves that which is fitly to receive many times over its whole extent likenesses of all things, that is of all external existences, to be itself naturally without part or lot in any of the forms. Therefore, the mother and recipient of creation, which is visible and by any sense perceptible, we must call neither earth, nor air, nor fire, nor water, nor the combination of these, nor the elements of which they are formed, but we shall not err in affirming it to be a viewless nature and formless, all receiving in some manner most bewildering and hard to comprehend it, partaking of the intelligible. But so far as from what has been said we may arrive at its nature, this would be the most just account of it. That part of it which is enkindled from time to time appears as fire, and that which is made liquid as water, and as earth and air such part of it as receives the likenesses of these. But in our inquiry concerning these, we must deliver a stricter statement. Is there an absolute idea of fire, and do all those absolute ideas exist to which in every case we always ascribe absolute being? Or do those things which we actually see or perceive with any other bodily sense alone possess such reality? And is it true that there are no manner of real existences beyond these at all, but we talk idly when we speak of an intelligible idea as actually existent, whereas it was nothing but a conception? Now it does not become us either to dismiss the present question unjudged and undecided, simply asserting that the ideas exist, nor yet must we add to our already long discourse another as long which is subordinate. But if we could see our way to a great definition couched in brief words, that would be most seasonable for our present purpose. Thus then do I give my own verdict. If reason and true opinion are of two different kinds, then the ideas do surely exist, forms not perceptible by our senses, the objects of thought alone. But if, as some hold true opinion differs nothing from reason, then all that we apprehended by our bodily organs we must affirm to be the most real existence. Now we must declare them to be two, because they are different in origin and unlike in nature. The one is engendered in us by instruction, the other by persuasion. The one is ever accompanied by right understanding, the other is without understanding. The one is not to be moved by persuasion, the other yields to persuasion. True opinion, we must admit, is shared by all men, but reason by the gods alone, and a very small portion of mankind. This being so, we must agree that there is first the unchanging idea, unbegotten and imperishable, neither receiving aught into itself from without, nor itself entering into aught else, invisible, nor in any wise perceptible, even that whereof the contemplation belongs to thought. Second, is that which is named after it and is like to it, sensible, created, ever in motion, coming to be in a certain place and again from thence, perishing, apprehensible by opinion with sensation. And the third kind is space, everlasting, admitting not destruction, but affording place for all things that come into being, itself apprehensible without sensation by a sort of bastard reasoning, hardly matter of belief. It is with this in view that dreaming we say that all which exists must be in some place and filling some space, and that what is neither on earth nor in heaven anywhere is naught. All these and many kindred fanciers have we even concerning that unsleeping essence and truly existing, for that by reason of this dreaming state we become impotent to arouse ourselves and affirm the truth. Namely, that to an image it belongs, seeing that it is not the very model of itself on which itself has been created, but is ever the fleeting semblance of another, in another to come into being, cling to existence as best it may, on pain of being nothing at all, but to the really existent essence reason, in all exactness true comes in a lie, declaring that so long as one thing is one and another thing is other, neither of them shall come to be in the other, so that the same becomes at once one and two. Such then is the statement for which I give my sentence, as we have briefly reasoned it out, that there are being in space and becoming, three in number, with threefold nature, even before the heavens were created. And the nurse of becoming being made liquid and fairy, and putting on the forms of earth and air, and undergoing all the conditions that attend thereupon, displays to view all manner of semblances. And because she is filled with powers that are not similar nor equivalent, she is at no part of her in even balance, but being swayed in all directions, unevenly she is herself shaken by the entering forms, and by her motion shakes them again in turn. And they, being thus steered, are carried in different directions and separated, just as by sieves and instruments. For winnowing corn the grain is shaken and shifted and sifted, and the dense and heavy parts go one way, and the raw and light are carried to a different place and settle there. Even so, when the four kinds are shaken by the recipient, which by the motion she has received acts as an instrument for shaking, she separates the most dissimilar elements furthest apart from one another, and the most similar she draws chiefly together, for which cause these elements had different regions. Even before the universe was ordered out of them and created, before that came to pass, all these things were without method or measure. But when an essay was being made to order the universe, first fire and water and earth and air, which had certain vestige of their own nature, yet were altogether in such a condition as we should expect for everything when God is not in it, being by nature in the state we have said, were then first by the Creator fashioned forth with forms and numbers, and that God formed them to be most fair and perfect, not having been so heretofore, must above all things be the foundation whereon our account is forever based. But now the disposition of each in their generation is what I must strive to make known to you in speech unwanted. But seeing you are no stranger to the paths of learning through which my sayings must be revealed to you, ye will follow me. In the first place, that fire and earth and water and air are material bodies is evident to all. Every form of body has depth, and depth must be bounded by plane surfaces. Now every rectangular plane is composed of triangles, and all triangles are derived from two triangles, each having one right angle and the other acute, and the others acute. And one triangle has one each side, a moiety of a right angle marked off by equal sides. The other has it divided into unequal parts by unequal sides. These we conceive to be the basis of fire and the other bodies, following up the probable account which is concerned with necessity. But the principle, yet more remote than these, are known but to God and to whatsoever man is a friend of God. Now we must declare what are the four fairest bodies that could be created, unlike one another, but capable, some of them, of being generated out of each other by their dissolution. For if we succeed in this, we have come at the truth concerning earth and fire and the intermediate proportionals. For we will concede to no one that there exist any visible bodies fairer than these, each after its own kind. We must do our diligence then to put together these four kinds of bodies most excellent in beauty, and so we shall say that we have a fully comprehension of their nature. Now of the two triangles, the isosceles has but one kind, but the scalene an endless number. But out of this infinite multitude, then we must choose the fairest, if we are to begin upon our own principles. If then any man can tell of a fairer kind that he has selected for the composition of these bodies, it is no enemy but a friend who vanquishes us. However, all these triangles we declare one to be the fairest, passing over the rest, that namely of which two conjoined form an equilateral triangle. The reason it were too long to tell, but if any man convict us in this, and find that is not so, the palm is ready for him, with our right goodwill. Let then two triangles be chosen whereof the substance of fire and of other elements has been wrought. The one isosceles, the other always having the square on the greater side 3 times the square on the lesser. And now we must more strictly define something which we expressed not quite clearly enough before, for it appeared as though all the four classes had generation through each other and into each other, but this appearance was delusive. For out of the triangles we have chosen arise 4 kinds, 3 from one of them, that which has unequal sides, and the 4th one alone composed of the isosceles triangle. It is not then possible for all of them by dissolution to pass one into another, a few large bodies being formed of many small, and the converse. But for 3 of them it is possible. For since they all arise from one basis, when the larger bodies are broken up, a number of small ones will be formed from the same elements, putting on the shapes proper to them. And again, when a number of small bodies are resolved into their triangles, they will become one in number and constitute a single large body of a different form. So much for their generation into one another. The next thing will be to say what is the form in which each has been created, and by the combination of what numbers. We will begin with the form which is simplest and smallest in its construction. Its element is the triangle, which has the hypotenuse double of the shorter side in length. If a pair of these are put together so that their hypotenuse coincide, and this is done 3 times in such a way that the hypotenuses and the shorter sides meet in one point as a center, thus one equilateral triangle has been formed out of the other 6 triangles. And if 4 equilateral triangles are combined so that 3 plane angles meet in a point, they make at each point one solid angle, that which comes immediately next to the most obtuse of plane angles. And when 4 such angles are produced, there is formed the first solid figure, dividing its whole surface into 4 equal and similar parts. The second is formed of the same triangles in sets of 8 equilateral triangles, bounding every single solid angle by 4 planes, and with the formation of 6 such solid angles, the second figure is also complete. The third is composed of 120 of the elementary triangles united, and of 12 solid angles, each contained by 5 planes equilateral triangles, and it has 20 equilateral surfaces. And the first element, when it had generated these figures, had done its part. The isosceles triangles generated the fourth combined in sets of 4, with the right angles meeting at the center, thus forming a single square. 6 of these squares joined together formed 8 solid angles, each produced by 3 plane right angles, and the shape of the body thus formed was cubical, having 6 square planes for its surfaces. And whereas a 5th figure yet alone remained, God used it for the universe in embellishing it with sides. Now, if any man, reflecting upon all these things, should fairly ask himself whether the number of cosmic systems is indefinite or definite, he would deem that to believe them indefinite was the opinion of one who thought very indefinitely on a matter where he ought to be most definitely informed. But whether we ought to say that there is but one, or that there are really in nature 5, he might, if he stopped short there, with more justice feel doubtful. Our verdict declares that according to the probable theory, it is by nature 1. Another, however, looking to some other guide, may have a different view, but no more of him. Let us assign the figures that have come into being in our theory to fire and earth and water and air. To earth let us give the cubical form, for earth is least mobile of the 4 and most plastic of bodies, and its substance must possess this nature in the highest degree, which has its basis most stable. Now of the triangles, which we assumed as our starting point, that with equal sides is more stable than that with unequal. And of the surfaces composed of the 2 triangles, the equilateral quadrangle necessarily is more stable than the equilateral triangle, both in its part and as a whole. Therefore, in assigning this to earth, we preserve the probability of our account, and also in giving to water the least mobile and to fire the most mobile of those which remain, while to air we give that which is intermediate. Again, we shall assign the smallest figure to fire, and the largest to water, and the intermediate to air, and the keenest to fire, the next to air, and the third to water. Now among all these, that which has the fewest bases must naturally in all respects be the most cutting and keen of all, and also the most nimble, seeing it is composed of the smallest number of similar parts. And the second must have these same qualities in the second degree, and the third in the third degree. Let it be determined then, according to the right account and the probable, that the solid body which has taken the form of the pyramid is the element and seed of fire, and the second in order of generation, let us say, to be that of air, and the third that of water. Now all these bodies we must conceive as being so small that each single body in the several kinds cannot for its smallness be seen by us at all, but when many are heaped together, their united mass is seen, and we must suppose that the due proportion in respect of their multitude and motions, and all their other powers when God had completed them with all perfection, in so far as the nature of necessity consenting and yielding to persuasion, suffered were everywhere by him ordained in fitting measure. From all that we have already said in the matter of these four kinds, the facts would seem to be as follows. When earth meets fire and is dissolved by the keenness of it, it would drift about, whether it were dissolved in fire itself, or in some mass of air or water, until the parts of it meeting and again being united became earth once more. For it never could pass into any other kind. But when water is divided by fire or by air, it may be formed again, and become one particle of fire and two of air. And the divisions of air may become for every particle broken up to particles of fire. And again, when fire is caught in air or in water or in earth, a little, in a wet bulk moving amid a rushing body and contending with it, it is vanquished and broken up to two particles of fire combined into one figure of air. And when air is vanquished and broken small, from two whole and as one half particle, one whole figure of water will be composed. Let us also reckon it once again thus, when any of the other kinds is intercepted in fire and is divided by it through the sharpness of its angles and its sides, if it forms into the shape of fire, it at once ceases from being divided. For a kind which is uniform and identical, of whatever sort it be, can neither be the cause of any change, nor can it suffer any from that which is identical and uniform with itself. But so long as passing into another kind, a lesser bulk contends with the greater, it ceases never from being broken. And when the smaller figures few in number and caught in a multitude of larger figures and are being broken in pieces and quenched, if they consent to combine into the form of the stronger, they then and there cease from being quenched, and from fire arises air, from air water. But if they assail the others, and another sort meet and contend with them, they cease not from being shattered, until being entirely repelled and dissolved, they find refuge with some of their kind, or being overcome, form from many of their own figures, one similar to the victorious elements, and there remains and abide with it. Moreover, on account of these conditions, they all are changing their places, for the bulk of every kind are sorted into separate regions of their own through the motion of the recipient, and those which are altered from their own nature and made like some other are carried by reason of this movement to the region proper to the elements to which they are assimilated. All unmixed and primary bodies have thus come into being through the cause we have described. But for the fact that within the several classes different kinds exist, we must assign as its cause the structure of the elementary triangles. It does not originally produce in each kind of triangle one and the same size only, but some greater and some less. And there are just so many sizes as there are kinds in the classes. And when these are mixed up with themselves or with one another, an endless diversity arises, which must be examined by those who would put forward a probable theory concerning nature. Now, concerning rest and motion, how they rise and under what conditions, we must come to an agreement, else many difficulties will stand in the way of our agreement that is to follow. This has been already in part set forth, but we have yet to add that in uniformity no movement will ever exist. For that which is to be moved should exist without that which is to be for that which is to be moved should exist without that which is to move it, or what is to move without that which is to be moved, is difficult or rather impossible. But without these there can be no motion, and for these to be uniform is not possible. So then let us always assign rest to uniformity and motion to its opposite. Now the opposite of uniformity is caused by inequality, and of inequality we have discussed the origin. But how it comes to pass that all bodies are not sorted off into their several kinds and cease from passing through one another and changing their place, this we have not explained. Let us put it again in this way. The revolution of the whole, when it had embraced the four kinds being circular with a natural tendency to return upon itself, compresses everything and suffers no vacant space to be left. Therefore, fire penetrates most of all through all things, and in the second degree air, since it is second in finest, and the rest in portion. For the substances which are formed of the largest part have the most void left in the structure, and those made of the smallest have the last. Now the constriction of this contracting force thrusts the small particles into the interspaces between the larger, so that when the small are set side by side with great, and the lesser particles divide the greater, while the greater compress the smaller, all things keep rushing backwards and forwards to their own region, since in changing its bulk, each changes its proper position in space. Thus, owing to these causes, a perpetual disturbance of uniformity is always kept up, and so preserves the perpetual motion of matter now and henceforth without cessation. Next, we must remember that of fire there are many kinds, for instance, flame, and that effluence from flame, which burns not but gives light to the eyes, and that which remains in the embers when the flame is out. And so with air, the purest is that which is called by the name of ether, and the most turbid is mist and gloom. And there are other kinds which have no name, arising from the inequality of the triangles. Of water there are two primary divisions, the liquid and the fusible kinds. The liquid sort owes its nature to possessing the smaller kinds of watery atoms, unequal in size, and so it can readily either move of itself or be moved by something else, owing to its lack of uniformity and the peculiar shape of its atoms. But that which consists of larger and uniform particles is more stable than the former and heavy, being stiffened by its uniformity, but when fire enters into it and breaks it up, it loses its uniformity and gains more power of motion. And as soon as it has become mobile, it is thrust by the surrounding air and spread out upon the earth, and it has received names descriptive of either process, melting of the dissolution of the mass, flowing of the extension on the ground. But when the fire goes forth from it again, seeing that it does not issue into empty space, the neighboring air receives a thrust, and while the liquid mass is still mobile, it forces it to fill up the vacant places of the fire and unites it with itself. And being thus compressed and recovering its uniformity, seeing that fire, the creator of inequality, is quitting, it settles into its normal state. And the departure of fire we call cooling, and the contraction that ensues on its withdrawal we class as solidification. Of all the substances which we have ranked as fusible kinds of water, that which is densest and formed of the finest and most uniform particles, a unique kind, combining brightness with a yellow hue, is gold, a most precious treasure, which is filtered through rocks and there congealed. And the offspring of gold, which is extremely hard owing to its density and has turned black, is called a diamond. Another has particles resembling those of gold, but more than one kind. In density, it even surpasses gold and has a small admixture of fine earth, so that it is harder but lighter because it has large interstices within. This formation is one of the shining and solid kinds of water and is called bronze. The earth, which is mingled with it, when the two through age begin to separate again, becomes visible by itself and is named rust. And it were no intricate task to explain all the other substances of this kind, following the outline of our probable account. For if we pursue this as a recreation, and while laying down the principles of eternal being, find implausible theories of becoming a pleasure that brings no remorse in its train, we may draw from it a sober and sensible amusement during our life. Now, therefore, setting out in this way, let us go on to discuss the probabilities that lie next on the same object. Water mingled with fire, such as is rare and liquid, owing to its mobility and its way of rolling along the ground, which gets it the name of liquid, and is also soft because its bases give way, being less stable than those of earth, when relinquished by fire and deserted of air, becomes more uniform and is compressed by the outgoing elements. Thus it is congealed, and when above the earth this process takes place in an extreme degree, the result is hail. If upon the earth it is ice, but when the process has not gone so far, but leave it half congealed above the earth, it is snow, and when congealed from dew upon the earth, it is called hoarfrost. Most forms of water which are intermingled with one another, filtered through the plants of the earth, are called by the class name of seps. But owing to their intermixture, they are all of diverse natures, and the great multitude of them are accordingly unnamed. 4 kinds, however, which are of a fiery nature, being more conspicuous, have obtained names. One that heats the soul and body together, namely wine. Next, the kind which is smooth and divides the visual current and therefore appears bright and shining to view and glistening. I mean the class of oils, resin and castor oils, and olive oil itself, and all others that have the same properties. Thirdly, that which expands the contracted pores of the mouth to the natural condition, and by this property produces sweetness to the taste. Of this, honey is the most general appellation. Lastly, that which corrodes the flesh by burning, a sort of frothy substance distinct from all the other saps, which has been named verjuice. Of the different kinds of earth, that which is strained through water becomes a stony mass in the following way. When the commingled water is broken up in the mixing, it changes into the form of air, and having become air, it darts up to its own region. Now there was no void surrounding it. Accordingly, it gives a thrust to the neighboring air, and the air, being weighty, when it is thrust and poured around the mass of earth, presses it hard and squeezes it into the spaces which the new-made air quitted. Thus earth, when compressed by air into a mass that will not dissolve in water, forms stone, of which the transparent sort made of equal and uniform particles is fairer, while that of the opposite kind is less fair. But that which is suddenly deprived of all its moisture by the rapid action of fire and has become more brittle than the first forms the class to which we have given the name of earthenware. Again, when some moisture is left behind, earth, after having been fused by fire and again cooled, becomes a certain stone of black color. There are also two sorts which, in the same manner, after the mixture, are robbed of a great part of the water, being formed of the finer particles of earth with a saline taste, and becoming only half solid and soluble, again by water. Of these, what purifies from oil and earth is alkali, while that which easily blends with all the combinations of tastes on the palate is, in the words of the ordinance, the God-beloved substance of salt. The bodies which are composed of earth and water combined cannot be dissolved by water, but by fire alone, for the following reason. A mass of earth is resolved neither by fire nor by air, because the atoms are smaller than the interstices in its structures, so that they have abundant room to move in and do not force their way, wherefore, instead of breaking it up, they leave it undissolved. But whereas the parts of water are larger, they make their passage by force and dissolve the mass by breaking it up. Earth, then, when it is not forcibly solidifies, is thus dissolved by water only, but when it is solidified, only by fire, for no entrance is left except to fire. And of water the most forcible congelation is melted by fire alone, but the more feeble both fire and air break up, the latter by the interstices, the former by the triangles as well. Air, when forcibly condensed, can only be resolved into the elementary triangles, and when uncondensed, fire alone dissolves it. In the case of a substance formed of water and earth combined, so long as water occupies the spaces in it that are forcibly compressed, the particles of water, arriving from without, find no entrance, but simply flow round and leave the whole bulk undissolved. But those of fires enter into the interstices of the water and, acting upon it, as water does upon earth, can alone cause the combined mass to melt and become liquid. In this class, those which have less water than earth are all kinds of glass, and all stones that are called fusible, and those which contain more water include all formations like wax and frankincense. Now all the manifold forms that arise from diverse shapes and combination and changes from one to another have been pretty fully set forth. Next, we must try to explain their affection and the causes that lead to them. First, we must assign to all the substances we have described the property of causing sensation, but the origin of flesh and all that belongs to it, and of the mortal part of soul, we have not yet discussed. Now this cannot be adequately dealt with apart from the affections of sense, nor yet can the latter without the former, yet to treat them both at once is hardly possible. We must assume one side then, and afterwards we will return to examine what we assumed. In order then that the properties of the several elements may be discussed in due order, let us first assume the nature of body and soul. First then let us see what we mean by calling fire hot, which we must consider in the following way, remembering the power of dividing and cutting with which fire exercises upon our body. That the sensation is a sharp one, we are all well enough aware, and the fineness of the edges and sharpness of the angles, beside the smallness of its particles and the swiftness of its motion, all of which qualities combine to render it so vehement and piercing as keenly to cut whatever meets it. All this we must take into account, remembering the nature of its figure, that this more than any other kind penetrates our body and minutely divides it, whence the sensation that we now call heat justly derive its quality and its name. The opposite condition, though obvious enough, still must not lack an explanation. When the larger particles of moisture which surround the body enter into it, they displace the smaller, and because they are not able to pass into their places, they compress the moisture within us. And whereas it was irregular and mobile, they render it immovable, owing to uniformity and contraction, and so it becomes rigid. And what is against nature contracted in obedience to nature struggles and thrusts itself apart, and to this struggling and quaking has been given the name of trembling and shivering, and both the effect of and the cause of it are in all cases termed cold. Hard is the name given to all things to which our flesh yields, and soft to those which yield to the flesh, and so also they are termed in their relation to each other. Those which yield are such as have a small base of support, and the figure with square surfaces, as it most firmly based, as it is most firmly based, is the most stubborn form. So too is whatever from the intensity of its compression offers the strongest resistance. Of heavy and light we shall find the clearest explanation if we examine them together with the so-called below and above. That there are naturally two opposite regions dividing the universe between them, one the lower to which sink all things that have material bulk, the other upper to which everything rises against its will, is altogether a false opinion. For since the form of the universe is spherical, all the extreme points, being equally distant from the center, are by their very nature equally extreme, and the center, being equally distant from all the extremes, ought to be regarded as opposite to all such points. This being the nature of the universe, how can one describe any of the said points as upper or lower, without justly being censured for using irrelevant terms? For the center cannot properly be described as being above or below, but simply as the center, while the circumference is neither itself central nor has any difference between the points on its surface, so that one has a different relation to the center from an opposite point. Since then it is everywhere uniform, how and in what sense can we suppose we are speaking correctly if we use terms which imply opposition? For suppose in the midst of the universe there were a solid body in equilibrium, it would have no tendency towards any point in the circumference, owing to the absolute uniformity of the whole. Indeed, if we were to walk round the sphere frequently as we stood at the antipodes of our former position, we should call the same point on its surface successively above and below. For this universe being spherical, as we just now said, no rational man can speak of one region as upper, of another as lower. However, whence these names were derived and under what conditions we use them to express this division of the entire universe, we may explain on the following hypothesis. In that region of the universe which is specially allotted to the element of fire, where indeed the greatest mass would be collected of that to which it is attracted, if one should attain to this place, acquiring the needful power, should separate portions of fire and weigh them in scales, when he raises the balance and forcibly drags the fire into the alien air, evidently he overpowers the smaller portion more easily than the larger. For when two masses are raised at once by the same force, necessarily the smaller yields more readily to the force. The larger, owing to its resistance less readily. Hence the larger mass is said to be heavy and to tend downwards, the smaller to be light and to tend upwards. This is exactly what we ought to detect ourselves doing in our own region. Moving as we do on the earth, we separate portions of earthly substance, or sometimes earth itself, and drag them into the alien air with unnatural force, for each portion clings to its own kind. Now the smaller mass yields more readily to our force than the larger, and follows quicker into the alien element. Therefore we call it light, and the place into which we force it above, while to the opposite conditions we apply the term heavy and below. Now, that these mutual relations should vary is inevitable, because the bulk of the several elements occupy contrary position in space. For as between a body that is light in one region and a body that is light in the opposite region, or as between two that are heavy, as well as upper and lower, all the lines of attraction will be found to become and remain relatively contrary and transverse and different in every possible way. But with all of them, this one principle is to be borne in mind, that in every case it is the tendency towards the kindred element that makes us call the falling body heavy and the place to which it falls below. while to the reverse relations we apply the opposite names. So much then for the case of these conditions. Of the qualities of smooth and rough, anyone could perceive the cause and explain it to another. The latter is produced by a combination of hardness and irregularity, the former by a combination of uniformity and density. We have yet to consider the most important point relating to the affections which concern the whole body in common, that is, the cause of pleasure and pain accompanying the sensation we have discussed, and also the affections which produce sensation by means of the separate bodily organs and which involve attendant pains and pleasures. This, then, is how we must conceive the causes in the case of every affection, sensible or insensible, recollecting how we defined above the source of mobility and immobility. For this is the way we must seek the explanation we hope to find. When that which is naturally mobile is impressed by even a slight affection, it spreads abroad the motion, the particles one upon another, producing the same effect. Until coming to the sentient part, it announces the property of the agent, but a substance that is immobile is too stable to spread the motion round about, and thus merely receives the affection, but does not steer any neighboring part, so that as the particles do not pass on one to another, the original impulse which affected them, they keep it untransmitted to the entire creature, and thus leave the recipient of the affection without sensation. This takes place with our bones and hair, and all the parts we have which are formed mostly of earth, while the former conditions apply in the highest degree to sight and hearing, because they contain the greatest proportion of fire and air. The nature of pleasure and pain must be conceived thus: an affection contrary to nature, when it takes place forcibly and suddenly within us, is painful. A sudden return to the natural state is pleasant. A gentle and gradual process is imperceptible, and one of an opposite character is perceptible. Now, a process which takes place with perfect facility is perceptible in a high degree, but is accompanied neither by pleasure nor by pain. An example will be found in the affections of the visual current, which we said above was in the daytime a material body cognate with ourselves. In this cutting and burning and any other affection cause no pain, nor does pleasure ensue when it returns to its normal state, but its perceptions are most vivid and accurate of whatever impresses it or whatsoever itself meets and touches. For its dilation and contraction are entirely free from violence, and on the other hand bodies formed of larger particles, reluctantly yielding to the agent and spreading the motion through the whole frame, cause pleasure and pain. When they are disturbed, giving pain and pleasure in being restored to their proper state. Those things which suffer gradual withdrawing and emptying, but have their replenishment sudden and on a large scale, are insensible to the emptying, but sensible of the replenishment, so that while they cause no pain to the mortal part of the soul, they produce very intense pleasure. This is to be observed in the case of sweet smells. But when the parts are disturbed suddenly, but gradually and laboriously restored to their former conditions, they afford exactly the opposite result to the former. This may be seen in the case of burns and cuts on the body. Now, the affection common to the body as a whole and the names that have been given to the agents which produces them have been well nigh expounded. Next, we must try to explain, if we can, what takes place in the separate parts of us, both as to the affection of them and the causes on the parts of the agents. First, then, we must set forth to the best of our power all that we left unsaid concerning taste, which are affections peculiar to the tongue. It appears that these, like most other things, are brought about by contraction and dilation, beside which they have more to do than other sensation with roughness and smoothness in the agents. For whenever earthy particles enter in by the little veins, which are a kind of tasting instruments of the tongue stretched to the heart, and strike upon the moist and soft parts of the flesh, these particles, as they are being dissolved, contract and dry the small veins. And if they are very rough, they are termed astringent, if less, so harsh. Such substances again, as are detergent and rinse the whole surface of the tongue, if they do this to an excessive degree and crouch so as to dissolve part of the structure of the flesh, as is the property of alkalis, all such are termed bitter, but those which fall short of the alkaline quality and rinse the tongue only to a moderate extent are saline without bitterness, and seem to us agreeable rather than the reverse. Those which share the warmth of the mouth and are softened by it, being simultaneously inflamed in themselves and turn scorching that which heated them, and which, owing to their lightness, fly upward to the senses of the head, penetrating all that is in their path. Owing to these properties, all such substances are called pungent. But sometimes these same substances, having been already refined by decomposition, enter into the narrow veins, being duly proportioned to the earthy particles and the particles of air which are there, so that they set them in motion and mingle together, and thereby cause them to jostle against one another, and taking up other positions to form new hollows extended round the entering particles, which hollows consist of a film of moisture, sometimes earthy, sometimes pure, embracing a volume of air, and thus they form moist capsules containing air. In some cases the films are of pure moisture and transparent and are called bubbles. In other they are of earthy liquid which effervesces and rises altogether when the name of seething and fermentation is given to it, and the cause of all these conditions is termed acid. The opposite affection to all those which have been described is produced by an opposite cause, when the structure of the entering particles amid the moisture, having a natural affinity to the tongue's normal condition, smooths it by modifying the roughened part, and relaxes it or contracts what is unnaturally contracted or expanded, and settles everything as much as possible in its natural state. Every such remedy of violent affection is to all of us pleasant and agreeable, and has received the name of sweet. Enough of this subject. As regards the faculty of the nostrils, no classification can be made, for smells are of a half-formed nature, and no class of figure has the adaptation requisite for producing any smell, but our veins in this part are formed too narrow for earth and water, and too wide for fire and earth, for which cause no one ever perceived any smell of these bodies. But smells arise from substances which are being either liquefied or decomposed or dissolved or evaporated. For when water is changing into air and air into water, odors arises in the intermediate condition, and all odors are vapor or mist, mist being the conversion of air into water, and vapor the conversion of water into air, whence all smells are subtler than water and coarser than air. This is proof when any obstacle is placed before the passages of respiration, and then one forcibly inhales the air, for then no smell filters through with it, but the air bereft of all scent alone follows the inhalation. For this reason the complex varieties of odors are unnamed, and are ranked in classes neither numerous nor simple. Only two conspicuous kinds are in fact here distinguished, pleasant and unpleasant. The latter roughens and irritations all the cavity of the body that is between the head and navel. The former smoothes the same region and restores it with contentment to its own natural condition. A third organ of sensation in us which we have to examine is that of hearing, and we must state the cause whence arise the affections connected with it. Let us in general terms define sound as a stroke transmitted through the ears by the air and passed through the brain and the blood to the soul, while the motion produced by it, beginning in the head and ending in the region of the liver, is hearing. A rapid motion produces a shrill sound, a slower one a deeper sound. Regular vibration gives an even and smooth sound, and the opposite a harsh one. If the movement is large, the sound is loud. If otherwise it is slight. Concerning accords of sound, we must speak later on in our discourse. A fourth faculty of sense yet remains, the intricate varieties of which it is our part to classify. To these we have given the name of colors, which consist of a flame streaming off from every object, having its particles so adjusted to those of the visual current as to excite sensation. We have already set forth the causes which gave origin to vision. Thus, therefore, it will be most natural and fitting for a rational theory to treat of the question of colors. The particles which issue from outward objects and meet the visual stream are some of them smaller, some larger, and some equal in size to the particles of that stream. Those of equal size cause no sensation, and these we call transparent. But the larger and smaller, in the one case by contracting, in the other by dilating it, produce effects keen on the tongue, of astringent tastes, and the heating sensation which we term pungent. These are white and black affections, identical with those just mentioned, but occurring in a different class and seeming to be different for the cause aforesaid. We must then classify them as follows. What dilates the visual stream is white, and the opposite thereof is black. A swifter motion belonging to a different kind of fire which meets and penetrates the visual stream quite up to the eyes and forcibly displaces and decomposes the pores of the eyes themselves, draws from thence a combined body of fire and water, which we call a tear. And whereas this agent is itself fire, meeting the other from the opposite direction, and one fire leaps forth as lightning from the eyes, while the other enters in and is quenched in the moisture, all manner of colors arise in this commixture. And to the sensation we give the name of dazzling, and the agent which produces it we call bright and shining, a kind of fire which is intermediate between the two former, when it reaches the moisture of the eye and is mingled with it but does not flash, produces a blood-like color by the mixture of fire with the gleam of the moisture, and the name we give it is red. Bright combined with red and white makes yellow. In what proportion they are mingled, if it were not reasonable to say, even if we knew, for there is neither any inevitable law nor any probable account thereof, which we might properly declare. Red mingled with black and white becomes purple, which turns to dark violet when these ingredients are more burned and a greater quantity of black is added. Chestnut arises from the mixture of yellow and grey from white and black. Pale buff is from white mixture with yellow. When bright meets white and is steeped in intense black, a deep blue color is the result, and deep blue mingled with white produces pale blue. And chestnut with black makes green. And for the remaining colors it is pretty clear from the foregoing to what combinations we ought to assign them, so as to preserve the probability of our account. But if a man endeavor to make practical trial of these theories, he will prove himself ignorant of the difference between divine and human intelligence. That God has sufficient understanding and power to blend the many into one, and again to resolve the one into many. But no man is able to either of these, or either of these, now or henceforth forever. All these things being thus constituted by necessity, the Creator of the most fair and perfect in the realm of becoming took them over when he was generating the self-sufficing and most perfect God, using the forces in them as subservient causes, but himself working out the good in all things that come into being. Wherefore we must distinguish two kinds of causes, one of necessity and one of God. And the divine we must seek in all things, for the sake of winning a happy life, so far as our nature admits of it. And the necessary for the sake of the divine, reflecting that without these we cannot apprehend by themselves the other truths which are the object of our serious studies, nor grasp them, nor in any other way attain to them. Now, therefore, that the different kinds of causes lie ready sorted to our hands, like wood prepared for a carpenter, of which we must weave the web of our ensuing discourse, let us in brief speech return to the beginning and proceed once more to the spot whence we arrived at our present point. And so let us endeavor to add an end and a climax to our story, comfortable with what has gone before. As was said then at the beginning, when God found these things without order, either in the relation of each thing to itself or of one to another, he introduced proportion among them in as many kinds and ways as it was possible for them to be proportionate and harmonious. For at that time neither had they any proportion except by mere chance, nor did any of the bodies that now are named by us deserve the names such as fire and water and the other elements. But first he ordered all these, and then out of them wrought this universe a single living creature, containing within itself all living creatures, mortal and immortal, that exist. And of the divine he himself was the creator, but the creation of mortals he delivered over to his own children to work out. And they, in imitation of him, having received from him the immortal principle of soul, fashioned round about her immortal body, and gave her all the body to ride in. And beside her they built in another kind of soul, even that which is mortal, having within itself dread and inevitable passions. First pleasure, the strongest allurement of evil, next pains that scare good things away, confidence moreover, and fear, a yoke of thoughtless counselors, wrath hard to assuage, and hope that lightly leads astray. And having mingled all these perforce with reasonless sensation and love that ventures all things, so they fashioned the mortal soul. And for this cause, in awe of defilling the divine, so far as was not altogether necessary, they set the mortal kind to dwell apart from the others, in another chamber of the body, having built an isthmus and boundary between their the head and the breast, setting the neck between them to keep them apart. So in the breast, or the thorax, as it is called, they confined the mortal kind of soul. And whereas one part of it was nobler, the other baser, they built a party wall across the hollow of the chest, as if they were marking off an apartment for woman and another for man, and they put the midriff as a fence between them. That part of the soul which shares courage and anger, seeing that is a warlike, they planted nearer the head, between the midriff and the neck, that it might be within hearing of the reason, and might join it in forcibly keeping down the tribe of lusts, when they would in no wise consent to obey the order and word of command from the citadel. And the heart, which is the knot of the veins, and the fount of the blood, which rushes vehemently through all the limbs they made into the guard house, that whensoever the fury of anger boiled up at the message from the reason, that some unrighteous dealing is being wrought around them, either without, or it may be by the lusts within, swiftly through all the narrow channels, all the sensitive power in the body might be aware of the admonitions and threats, and be obedient to them, and follow them all together, and so permit the noblest part to be leader among them all. For the throbbing of the heart in the anticipation of danger, or the excitement of wrath, since they foreknew that all such swelling of passions should come to pass by means of fire, they devised a plan of relief, and framed within us the structure of the lungs, which in the first place is soft and void of blood, and next is perforated within with cavities like those of a sponge, in order that receiving the breath and the drink, it might cause coolness and give rest and relief in the burning. Wherefore they made the one pipe for a channel to the lungs, which they set around the heart, as it were a soft cushion to spring upon, so that when wrath was at its height, therein the heart might leap upon a yielding substance, become cooled, and thus being less distressed, it might, together with the emotions, be better enabled to obey the reason. But that part of the soul which lusts after meat and drink, and all things whereof it has need owing to the body's nature, this they set between the midriff and the navel, and its boundary constructing in all this region as it were a manger for the sustenance of the body. And here they chained it like a wild beast, which must yet be reared in conjunction with the rest, if a mortal race were to be at all. To the end, then, that always feeding at its stall and dwelling as far as possible from the seat of counsel, it might produce the least possible tumult and uproar, and allow the noblest part to consult in peace for the commonweal. Here they assigned it its place. And knowing that it would have no comprehension of reason, and that even if it did in some way gain any perception of rational thought, it was not in its nature to take heed to any such things, but it would be entirely led away by images and shadows, both by night and by day. God devised as a remedy for this the nature of the liver, which he constructed and set in its dwelling place, and he made it a body dense and smooth and bright and sweet with a share of bitterness. This he did not to the end that the influence of thought proceeding from the brain, when the liver received outlines of them, as if in a mirror and exhibited reflections to view, might strike terror into the appetitive part, whenever making use of the bitter element, akin to its own dark nature, and threatening with stern approach, diffusing the bitterness swiftly throughout the whole liver, it displays a bilious color, and contracting it made it all rough and wrinkled, and reaching the lobe and the vessels and the inlet, twisted the first from its right position, and contorted it, while at the same time it obstructed and closed up the two latter, thereby producing pain and nausea. And on the other hand, in order that whenever a breath of mildness from the reason copied off on the liver visions of an opposite kind, giving release from the bitterness, because it will not excite a nature opposite to its own, nor have dealing with it, but using upon the liver the sweetness that exists therein, and soothing everything till all is straight and smooth and free, it might render gentle and calm that part of the soul which is settled about the liver, and might enable it to secure a sober amusement at night, enjoying divination during sleep in recompense for its deprivation, intelligence, and wisdom. For our creators, because they remembered the behest of their Father when he commanded them to make the mortal race as perfect as they were able, in this wise redeeming even the baser part of us, that it might have in some way a hold on the truth, placed in this region the seed of divination. Now that divination is the gift of God to human folly, this is a sufficient proof. No man in his sound senses deals in true and inspired divination, but when the power of his understanding is feathered in sleep or by sickness, or if he has become distraught by some divine possession. The part of the same man is to remember and interpret all things that are declared dreaming or waking by the prophetic and inspired nature, and whatsoever visions are beheld by the seer, to determine by reason in what way and to whom they betoken good or ill, in the future or the present or the past, but it is not for him who has become mad, and still is in that state to judge his own visions and utterances. The old saying remains true, that only for the sane man is it meet to act and to be the judge of his own action and of himself. Whence has arisen the custom of setting up interpreters as judges of inspired prophecy. These are themselves called prophet by some who are altogether unaware that they are but the expounders of mystic speech and visions, and ought not in strict accuracy to be called prophets, but interpreters of the prophecies. Such is the nature of the liver and its situation that we have described for the purpose of prophecy as aforesaid. And while each body has life, this organ displays the signs clearly enough, but when deprived of life, it has become blind and gives the token too dimly to afford any plain meaning. And the structure of the neighboring organ and its position on the left has been planned for the sake of the liver in order to keep it always bright and clean, as a napkin is prepared and laid ready for the cleansing of a mirror. Wherefore, whenever any impurities arise in the region of the liver owing to sickness of the body, all is received and purified by the fine substance of the spleen, which is woven, hollow, and void of blood. This, when it is filled with the impurities from the liver, waxes swollen and festered, and again when the body is purged, it is reduced and sinks again to its natural state. Now as concerning soul, how far she has immortal, now as concerning soul, how far she has a mortal, how far a divine nature, and in what wise and with what conjunctions, and for what causes she has her separate habitations. Only when God has confirmed our statement can we confidently aver that it is true. Nevertheless, if we have given the probable account, we may venture to say even now and still more on further meditations, and so let it be said. But what follows upon the foregoing is the next object of our research. This was the manner wherein the rest of the body has come into being. The following is the design on which it were most fitting to conceive that it is constructed. They who framed our race knew the interference in meat and drink that would prevail in us, and that for greed we should use far more than was moderate or necessary. In order, then, that swift destruction through sickness might not fall upon us, and that the mortal race might not perish out of hand before coming to completion, foreseeing the danger, they made the abdomen, as it is called, a receptacle to contain the superfluity of food and drink, and coiled the bowls round about therein, lest the food, passing speedily through should compel the body quickly to stand in need of a fresh supply, and thus producing an insatiable craving, should render the whole race through gluttony devoid of philosophy and letters and disobedient to the highest part of our nature. Concerning the bones and the flesh, and all such substances, the case stands thus. The foundation of all these is the marrow. For the bonds of life whereby the soul is bound to the body were fastened in it throughout and planted therein the roots of human nature. But the marrow itself comes from other sources, such of the primal triangles as were unwarped and smooth, and thus able to produce fire and water and air and earth of the purest quality. These God selected and set apart, each from its own class, and mingling them in proportion one with another to make a common seed for all the ways of mortals, he formed of them the marrow. And thereafter he implemented and fastened in it the several kinds of soul, and according to the number to the number and fashion of the shapes that the soul should have corresponding to her kinds into so many similar forms did he divide the narrow at the very outset of his distribution. And that which should be, as it were, a field to contain in it the divine seed, he molded in a spherical form all round, and this part of the marrow he called the brain, which the view that when each animal was completed, the vessel containing it should be the head, but that which was to have the mortal part of soul, which remained, he distributed into molds that were at once round and elongated, but he called all these forms marrow, and from these, as though from anchors, he put forth bonds to fasten all the soul, and then he wrought the entire body round about it, first building to fence it a covering of bone. And bone he formed in this way, having sifted out earth that was pure and smooth, he kneaded and soaked it with marrow, and after that he placed it in fire. And next he set it in water, and getting in fire, and once more in water, and thus having shifted it many times from one to another, he made it indissoluble by either. Making use of this, he carved a bony sphere thereof to surround the brain, but on one side he left a narrow outlet, and round the marrow of the neck and back he made vertebrae of bone and set them to serve as pivots, beginning at the head and carrying them through the whole length of the body. Thus, to preserve all the seed, he enclosed it in a strong envelope, and he made joints in it using the power of the other as an intermediary between the parts for the sake of moving and bending them. But deeming that the structure of bone was too rigid and inflexible that should it be inflamed and cooled again, it would rot away and quickly destroy the seed within it. For this cause God devised the sinews and the flesh, that binding all the limbs together with the former, he might by their tension and relaxation round their pivots enable the body to bend and extend itself, while the flesh he designed as a defense against heat and a shelter from cold, and moreover that it might be, like coverings of felt, a protection against falls, gently and easily yielding to external bodies. And containing a warm moisture within itself, in summer it might exude this, and spreading dampness on the surface might diffuse a natural coolness over all the body. But in winter, on the other hand, it might by its own fire afford a fair protection against the frost that assailed and surrounded it from without. Considering this, he that molded us like wax made a mixture and blending of water and fire and earth, and compounding a ferment of acid and salt. He mingled it with them and produced soft flesh full of sap. The sinews he composed of bone and unfermented flesh, a separate substance having an intermediate function, and to this he added a yellow color. Accordingly, the sinews received a power more firm and tenacious than the flesh, but more soft and flexible than the bones. With these God covered the bones and marrow, and after he bound one part to another with the sinews, he enveloped them over all with flesh. Those bones which were chiefly inhabited by soul he enclosed with the smallest amount of flesh, but those wherein was least soul he covered most abundantly and densely with it. Moreover, at the joints of the bones, save where reason showed that it ought to be there, he put but little flesh, that neither it might render the body unwieldy, by hindering its flexions and impeding its motion, nor again that a dense mass of flesh piled together, producing by its hardness a dullness of sensation, might render the faculties of the mind too slow of memory and hard of apprehension. Wherefore the ties and the shines and the parts of the hips and the bones and the upper arms and the forearms and all parts of our limbs which are without joints and all bones which are devoid of intelligence, owing to the small amount of soul inhering in marrow, within them all these are abundantly furnished with flesh, but those which are the seat of intelligence have less, except in cases where God has formed the flesh to be in itself an organ of sensation, as for instance the tongue. In most, however, it is as aforesaid, for this material nature, which comes into being by the law of necessity and is reared with us, does not allow dense bone and much flesh to be accompanied by ready and keen perception. For had these two conditions consented to combine, the structure of the head would have displayed them in the highest degree, and the human being bearing upon it a fleshy head, sinewy and strong, would have enjoyed life twice, nay, many times as long as now, beside being much more healthy and free from pain. But as it is the creators who brought us to being considered, whether they should make a long-lived race that was inferior, or one more short-lived which was nobler, and they agreed that every one must by all means choose a shorter and nobler life in preference to a longer but baser. Therefore they covered the head with thin bone, but not with flesh, nor sinews, since it has no flexions. On all these grounds, the head that is set upon the body of every man is much quicker of the apprehension and understanding, but much weaker. For these reasons, and in this manner, God placed the sinews all round the base of the head, about the neck, and cemented them with uniformity. And he fastened the extremities of the jawbones to them just under the face. Under the rest he distributed over all the limbs, uniting joint to joint. And our framers ordained the functions of the mouth, furnishing it with teeth and tongue and lips in the way it is now arranged, combining in the purpose the necessary and the best, for they devised the incoming with the necessary in view, but the outgoing with the most excellent. For all that enters in to give sustenance to the body is of necessity, but the stream of speech which flows out and ministers to understanding is of all streams the most noble and excellent. But as to the head, it was neither possible to leave it of bare bone, owing to the extremes of heat and cold in the seasons, nor yet by covering it over to allow it to become dull and senseless through the burden of flesh, of the fleshy material as it was drying. A larger film formed on the surface and separated itself. This is what is now called skin. This, by the influence of the moisture of the brain, combined and grew up and clothed the head all around. And the moisture rising up under the sutures saturated and closed it in on the crown, fastening it together like a knot. Now the form of the sutures is manifold, owing to the power of the soul's revolutions and of the element. If these contend more vehemently one with another, the sutures are more in number, but if less so, they are fewer. Now the whole of the skin was pricked all about with fire by the divine part, and when it was pierced, and the moisture issued forth through it, all the moisture and heat which was pure vanished away, but that which was mingled with the substances whereof the skin was formed, being lifted up by the impulse, stretched far outwards in finest equaling the size of the puncture, but owing to the slowness of its motion, it was thrust back by the surrounding air, and being forced in and rolled up under the skin, it took root there. Under these conditions, hair grows up in the skin, being of similar nature, but of thread-like appearance, and made harder and denser by the contraction of cooling. For every hair in being separated from the skin was cooled and contracted. Hereby has our Creator made our head hairy, using the means aforesaid, and conceiving that this instead of flesh should be a covering for the protection of the brain, being light and capable of affording shade from heat and shelter from cold, where it would be no hindrance in the way of ready apprehension. The threefold combination of sinew, skin, and bone in the fabric of the fingers, when dried forms out of all a single hard skin, for the construction of which these substances served as means, but the true cause and purpose of its formation was the welfare of races not yet existing. For our creators were aware that man should pass into woman and afterwards into beasts, and they knew that many creatures would need the aid of nails for many purposes, wherefore at the very birth of the human race they fashioned the rudiments of nails. On such reasoning and with such purposes did they form skin and hair, and on the extremities of the limbs nails. Now when all the parts and members of the mortal being were created in union, and since his life was made perforce dependent upon fire and earth, and therefore his body suffered waste, through being dissolved and left void by these, the gods devised secure for him. They engendered another nature akin to the nature of man, blending it with other forms and sensation, so as to be another kind of animals. These are the cultivated trees and plants and seeds which are trained by culture and domesticated with us. But formerly there existed only the wild kinds, which are older than the cultivated. For indeed everything which partakes of life may with perfect justice and fitness be termed an animal, but the kind of which we are now speaking shares only the third form of soul, which our theory says is seated between the midriff and the navel, and which has nothing to do with opinion and reasoning and thought, but only with sensation, pleasant or painful, with appetites accompanying. For it ever continues passively receptive of all sensations, and having its circulation in itself about its own center, it rejects all motion from without and uses only its own. But its nature has not bestowed upon it any power of observing its own being and reflecting thereon. Wherefore, it is indeed alive, and in no wise differs from an animal. But it is stationary and rooted fast because it has been denied the power of self-motion. Thus did the higher power create all these kinds of sustenance for us who were feebler, and next they made canals in the substance of our body, as though they were cutting runnels in a garden, that it might be irrigated as by an inflowing stream. And first they carried like hidden rills under the place where the skin and the flesh are joined, two veins down the back, following the twofold division of the body into right and left. These they brought down on either side of the spine and the similar marrow, first in order that it might be most vigorous, next that the current might have an easy flow downwards and render the irrigation regular. After that they cleft the veins around the head, and interweaving them crossed them in opposite direction, carrying these forms the right side of the body to the left, and those from the left to the right. This they did partly in order that together with the skin they might form a bond to fasten the head to the body, seeing that it was not set round with sinews on the crown, and also that this might be a means of distributing from each side throughout the whole body the sensation due to the perceptions. And next to this they designed the irrigation on a kind of plan which we shall better discern by assuming the following premises. All bodies which are composed of smaller particles exclude the larger, but the larger cannot exclude the smaller. Fire is composed of finer particles than any other element, whence it penetrates through water and earth and air and whatever is composed of them, nothing can keep it out. This rule must also be applied to the human belly. When food and drink enters into it, it keeps them in, but air and fire being finer than its own structure, it cannot keep in. Accordingly, God uses these two elements for the conveyance of liquid from the belly to the veins, weaving of air and fire. A network like a fish trap or wheel, having two lesser wheels within with a double inlet, one of which inlets he again wove with two passages, and from the lesser wheels he stretched as it were cords on all sides to the extremities of the network. All the inner part of the net he constructed of fire, but the lesser wheels and the envelope he made of airy substance. And he took the net and rubbed it in manner following about the animal he had molded. The structure of the lesser wheels he carried into the mouth, and these being twofold, he let down one of them by the windpipe into the lungs, the other passed the windpipe into the belly. The one wheel he split in two, and he let both inlets meet by the passages of the nostrils, so that when the first inlet was not in action, by way of the mouth all its currents also might be replenished from the second. But with the general surface of the network he enveloped all the hollow part of our body, and all this, seeing it was air, he now caused to flow gently into the lesser wheels, now made them flow back upon it. And since the body is of porous texture, the network passeth through it, inward and again outward, and the beams of fire which are confined within follow the air as it moves in either direction, and this never ceases to go on so long as the mortal creature holds together. To this process he, who appointed names, gave, we say, the title of inspiration and expiration, and from this condition, both active and passive, it has come about that our body deriving moisture and coolness has its sustenance in life. For when as the respiration passes in and out, the interwoven fire within follows it, and entering the belly swings up and down and meets the food and drink. It dissolves them, and reducing them to small particles, drives them along the channels through which it flows, pumping them into the veins like spring waters into conduits, and so it makes the current of the veins flow through the body as through an aqueduct. Let us once more examine the process of respiration and the cause which have led to its present conditions. These are as follows. Since there is no void into which any moving body could enter, and since the breath issues forth from us, the consequence is clear to everyone. Instead of entering into a void space, it thrusts the neighboring matter out of its place, and this yielding to the thrust drives to void that which is immediately nearest, and all being driven round by this compulsion enters into the place whence the breath came forth, and replenishing the same follows after the breath. And this whole process goes on like the rotation of a wheel, because there is no void. Therefore, when the cavity of the chest and the lungs send forth the breath, they are again replenished by the air surrounding the body, which penetrates inwards through the flesh, seeing it is porous and is forced round in a circuit. And again, when the air returns and passes forth through the body, it thrusts the breath back again inwards through the passages of the mouth and nostrils. The cause which sets this principle in action we may describe thus. In every animal, the inner parts about the blood and veins are the hottest, as if there were a fount of fire contained in it. This is what we compare to the network of the wheel, supposing that all the part extending from the middle to the sides is woven of fire, but the outer part of air. Now we must admit that the heat naturally tends outward to its own region and its own kin. And whereas there are two means of grease, one out through the body, the other by way of the mouth and nostrils, when it makes for one exit, it impels the air round towards the other. And the air so impelled, falling into the fire, is heated, but that which passes out is cooled. So the heat changes its position, and the parts about the other outlet became warmer. Therefore, the heat now has a stronger tendency in the new direction, seeking its own affinity, and impels the air by the other passage. And this, undergoing the same change and reproducing the same process, is thus by these two impulses converted into a wheel swaying backwards and forwards, and so it gives rise to respiration. In the same direction are we to look for the explanation of the phenomena of medical cupping glasses, and of swallowing, and of projected bodies, whether cast through the air or moving along the ground, and of sounds too, which from their swiftness and slowness seem to us so shrill or deep, sometimes having no harmony in their movements, owing to the irregularity of the vibrations they produce in us, sometimes being harmonious through regularity. For the slower sounds overtake the motions of the first and swifter sounds, when these are already beginning to die away and have become assimilated to the motions which the slower on their arrival impart to them. And on overtaking them, they do not produce discord by the intrusion of an alien movement, but adding the commencement of a slower motion which corresponds to that of the swifter. Now that the latter is beginning to cease, they form one harmonious sensation by the blending of shrill and deep. Thereby they afford pleasure to the foolish, but to the wise joy, through the imitation of the divine harmony which is given by mortal motions. And the flowing of our waters, the fall of thunderbolts, and the wonderful attracting power of amber and of the lodestone, all these are due to no drawing power, but to two causes. First, there is no void, and the atoms jostle one upon another. Secondly, when they are divided or contracted, they change places and move severally towards their own region, and by the complication of such conditions, all these wonders arise, as will be plain to him who examines them by the proper method. The process of respiration, then, whence this discussion arose, rests on the principle and cause which have been set forth. Fire divides the food falling in the air as it sways up and down within, and through this oscillation it replenishes the veins from the belly by pumping into them from thence the comminuted food. In this way, throughout the whole body of all animals, the streams of nourishments are kept constantly supplied, and the particles of food being freshly severed, and from kindred substances, some from fruits and some from herbs, which God planted just to be our sustenance, have all manner of colors owing to their intermixture, but a red hue pervades them most of all through the natural contrivance, whereby the fire divides the food and imprints its own hue upon it. Whence the color of the fluid that circulates through the body has the appearance we have described. This we call blood, which is the sustenance of the flesh and of all the body, and from which all parts draw moisture to fill up the places that are left void. And the mode of replenishment and evacuation is like the motion of all things in the universe, whereby all kindred substances seek each other. The elements that surround us without are constantly dissolving our substance and distributing it to its several kinds, returning each to its own kindred, and again the particles of blood being minutely divided within us and enveloped in every creature by the body, as though by a heaven surrounding them, are forced to copy the universal motion. Therefore, each of the divided particles within us is carried to its own kind, and thus replenishes again what was left void. Now, when the loss is greater than the replenishment, everything diminishes, but when less, it increases. The young frame, then, of the entire creature, having the triangles of its elements still as if fresh from the workshop, has them firmly linked one to another, but the whole mass is soft in substance, seeing that it has been newly formed out of marrow and nurtured upon milk. Now, for as much as the triangles of the substances composing the food and drink, which enter from without and are received within the young creature, are older and feebler than those of the latter, it divides and subdues them with its new triangles. By the assimilation of a larger number nourishes and increases the animal. But when the exact outline of the triangles is blunted because they have been for a long time struggling with many others, they are not able as of old to comminute and assimilate the entering alignment, but are themselves easily divided by the incoming particles. At such a time, every living thing is enfeebled and wastes away, and this condition is termed old age. Finally, when the bonds of the triangles belonging to the marrow no longer hold to their fastening, but snap asunder with the stress, they lose in their turn the bounds of the soul, and she, being in the course of nature released, flies away with gladness. For all that is contrary to nature is painful, but whatsoever takes place in a natural way is pleasant. On the same principle, death, which ensues upon sickness or wounds, is painful and violent, but that which draws to the natural end in the course of old age is of all deaths the least distressing, and is accompanied rather by pleasure than by pain. Now, the cause when sickness arises is doubtless evident to all, for seeing there are four elements of which the body is composed: earth, fire, water, and air. Any unnatural excess of defect of these, or change of positions from their own to an alien region, and also since there are more than one kind of fire and the other elements, the reception by each of an unfitting kind and other such causes all combine to produce discord and disease. For when any of them changes its nature and position, the parts that formerly were cool are heated, and those that were dry become afterwards moist, and the light becomes heavy, and all undergo every kind of change. The only way we allow in which one and the same substance can remain whole and unchanged and sound is that the same element should be added to it or taken away from it on the same principle and in the same manner and proportion, and whatsoever errs in any of these points in its outgoings or incomings causes a vast diversity of vicissitudes and diseases and destructions. Next, in the secondary structures, which are in a natural state of union, a second class of disease may be discerned by one who would scrutinize them. For whereas marrow and bone and flesh and sinew are composed of the four elements, and blood is formed of the same, though in a different way, most of the diseases arise in the manner before explained, but the gravest afflict them with especial severity in the following way. That is to say, when the order of their generation is reversed, these structures are then destroyed. For in the course of nature, flesh and sinews arise from blood, the sinews from the fibrine, owing to their affinity, the flesh from the clots which are formed when the fibrine is separated. From the sinews and flesh again proceed a glutinous and oily fluid, which not only cements the flesh to the structure of the bones and itself gives nourishment and growth to the bone, which encloses the marrow, but also so much of it as filters through the dense substance of the bones, being formed of the purest and smoothest and most slippery kind of the triangles. As it distills and oozes from the bones, irrigates the marrow. When these structures are produced in this order, health is the result as a rule. But when this is reversed, sicknesses ensues. For when the flesh decomposes and returns the deliquescent matter to the veins, then is mingled with air in the veins much blood of manifold kinds, with diverse hues and bitter qualities, as well as acid and saline properties, and this contains all kinds of bile and serums and phlegm. For as all these are going the wrong way and have become corrupt, first they ruin the blood itself, and furnishing no nutriment to the body rush in all directions through the veins, paying no heed to the periods appointed by nature, but at war one with another, because they have no good of each other, at war also with all that is established and fixed in the body, which they corrupt and dissolve. Now when the oldest part of the flesh is decomposed, being hard to soften, it turns black through long continued burning, and through being everywhere corroded, it is bitter and dangerous to whatever part of the body it attacks which is not yet corrupted. Sometimes this black sort is acid instead of bitter. When the bitterness is more refined away. And again, the bitter sort, being steeped in blood, gains a redder hue. And when black is mingled with this, it is greenish. Sometimes too, a yellow color is added to the bitterness when new flesh is decomposed by the fire of the inflammation. To all these symptoms, the general name of bile has been given, either by physicians or by someone who, in looking at many dissimilar appearances, was able to see one universal quality pervading them all, which deserved a name. All other kinds of bile, which are reckoned, have their several descriptions according to their color. Of lymph, one kind is the mild serum of blood, the other is an acrid secretion of black and acid bile. When that is blended through inflammation with a saline property, this kind is called acid phlegm. But that which is formed in conjunction with air by the liquefaction of new and tender flesh, when it is inflated with air, enveloped by moisture, and through this condition bubbles are formed, invisible separately because of their smallness, but altogether becoming visible in the mass and presenting a white color to view by the formation of froth. This liquefaction of tender flesh in combination with air we term white phlegm. The serum of fleshly formed phlegm is sweat and tears, and whatever other secretion purify the body from day to day. All these become a means of disease when the blood is not replenished from the food and drink in the natural way, but receives its volume in the contrary manner in despite of nature's law. Now when the flesh is anywhere pierced by disease, but the foundation of it remain intact, the malady has only half its power, for there is still the prospect of ready recovery. But when that which unites the flesh to the bones is diseased, and in turn no longer by distilling both from the fibers and sinews nourishes the bones and cements the flesh to them, but instead of being oily and smooth and glutinous becomes harsh and saline and shriveled through an unhealthy habit of life, and under these conditions all that substances crumble away under the flesh and the sinews and separates from the bones, where the flesh, falling away from its foundation, leaves the sinews bare and full of brine, and itself falling back into the current of the blood aggregates and diseases that have been described. But distressing as are these symptoms which affect the body, yet more serious are those which are prior in order, when the bones, owing to denseness of the flesh, cannot get sufficient air and becoming moldy and heated, decay away, and while they will not receive their nourishment, crumble down and return by a reverse process into the nourishing fluid, and that in its turn passing into flesh, and the flesh into blood, they render all the disease more violent than those already mentioned. The most desperate case of all is when the substance of the marrow becomes diseased by any defect or excess. This produces the most serious and fatal disorders, seeing that the whole nature of the body is forced to proceed in a backward course. A third class of disease we must conceive of as occurring in three ways: one by the agency of air, the second of phlegm, and the third of bile. For when the lungs, which are dispensers of air to the body, do not keep their passages clear because they are implanted by catarrh, the air falling to pass through some and in others entering with a volume unduly great causes the decomposition of the parts which lack their supply of air, and forces its way through the channels of the veins and dislocates them, and dissolving the body, it is confined amid its substance, occupying the midriff, and so countless painful diseases are produced from these causes, accompanied by excessive sweat. Often too, when the flesh is broken up, air is formed in the body, and being unable to find an exit, it produces the same torments as are caused by the air which enters in. The most severe of all, when gathering and swelling up around the sinews and the blood vessels in these parts, it strains the tendons of the shoulders and the muscle attached to them in the backward direction, and owing to the intense strain produced in this condition, these affections are called tetanus and ophistotonus. For these the remedy is severe, for in fact fevers supervening chiefly give relief in such cases. The white phlegm, when intercepted, is dangerous owing to the air in the bubbles, but when it finds an escape to the surface of the body, it is more mild. yet it disfigures the person by genuine scabs and leprosis and kindred maladies. Sometimes it is mingled with black bile and is shed upon the revolutions in the head, which are the most divine and confounds them. And if this occurs during sleep, the effects are milder, but if in the waking hours it is harder to relieve. This, as affecting the sacred part, is justly called the sacred disease. Acid and psyllium phlegm is the source of all diseases that make the form of catarrh, and these have received manifold names according to the diverse places in which the discharge takes place. Inflammation in various parts of the body, so called from the heat and burning that occurs, are all due to bile. When they have egress, they seethe up and send forth all kind of pustules. But if they are suppressed within, they cause many inflammatory disease, of which the worst, when the inflammation entering into pure blood carries away from its proper place the fibrin which was distributed through the blood in order that it might preserve a due measure of thinness and thickness, and neither be so much liquefied by heat as to flow out through the porous texture of the body, nor become sluggish from excessive density and circulate within difficulty in the veins. Now the fibrin, by the nature of its composition, preserves the due mean in these respects, for from blood that is dead and beginning to cool, the fibrin be gathered apart, the rest of the blood is dissipated, but if the fibrin be allowed to remain, by the help of the cold air surrounding it quickly congeals it. The fibrin then in the blood having this property, bile, which is naturally formed of old blood and is dissolved again into blood out of the flesh and is warm and liquid into the blood, at first gradually, and is condensed by the power of the fibrin, and as it is condensed and forced to cool, it produces internal chill and shivering. But when a greater quantity flows in, it subdues the fibrin with its heat, and boiling up scatters it abroad, and if it is able to obtain the mastery to the end, it penetrates the substance of the marrow, and consuming it looses from thence the bonds of the soul, as it were the moorings of a ship, and sets her free. But when the bile is too feeble for this, and the body holds out against the dissolution itself, is vanquished, and either is expelled by an eruption of the whole body, or is driven through the veins into the lower or upper belly, like an exile banished from a city that has been at civil war, and as it issues forth from the body, it causes diarrhea and dysentery, and all diseases of that kind. When the body has been stricken with sickness, chiefly through excess of fire, it exhibits continued inflammation and fevers. Excess of air causes quotidian fevers, excess of water thirtian, because it is more sluggish than air or fire. Excess of earth, which is by four measures most sluggish of all, being purged in a 4 period of time, gives rise to quartan fevers and is with difficulty banished. Such are the conditions connected with disease of the body. Those of the soul depend upon bodily habit in the following way. We must allow that disease of the soul is senselessness, and of this there are two forms, madness and stupidity. Every condition, then, in which a man suffers from either of these must be termed a disease. We must also affirm that the gravest maladies of the soul are excessive pleasures of pain. For if a man is under the influence of excessive joy, or on the other hand of extreme pain, and is eager and dully to grasp the one or shun the other, he is able neither to see nor to hear anything aright. He is delirious, and at that moment entirely unable to obey reason. In whomsoever the seed in the region of the marrow is abundant and fluid, and like a tree that is fruitful beyond due measure, he feels from time to time many a sore pang, and many a delight amid his passions and their fruits, and he becomes mad for the greater part of his life, owing to the intensity of pleasures and pains, keeping his soul in a state of disease and derangement. Through the power of the body, he is not, however, regarded as sick, but as willingly vicious. But the truth is that incontinence in sensual pleasures is a disease of the soul, for the most part arising from the fluid and moist condition of one element in the body, owing to porosis of the bones. So it is too with nearly all intemperance in pleasure, and the reproach attaching thereto, as if man were willingly vicious, is incorrectly brought against them. For no one is willing wicked, but it is owing to some bad habits of body and unenlightened training that the wicked man become wicked. And these are always unwelcome and imposed against his will. And where pains are concerned, the soul likewise derives much evil from the body. For where the humours of acid and salt flagons, and those that are bitter and bilious, roam about the body and find no outlet to the surface, but being pent up within and blending their own exaltation with the movement of the soul are mingled therewith, they induce all kinds of mental diseases, more or less violent and serious. And rushing to the three regions of the soul and part which each attacks, they multiply manifold forms of moroseness and melancholy, of rashness and timidity, of forgetfulness and dullness. And when besides these vicious conditions there are added bad governments and bad principle maintained in public and private speech, when moreover no studies to be an antidote are pursued from youth up, then it is that all of us who are wicked become so, owing to two causes entirely beyond our own control. The blame must lie rather with those who train than with those who are trained, with the educators than the educated. However, we must use our utmost zeal by education pursuits and studies to shun vice and embrace virtue. This subject, however, belongs to a different branch of inquiry. The counterpart to that has been said, the treatment of body and mind and the principles by which they are preserved were the proper and fitting complement of our discourse. For it is more just to dwell upon good than upon evil. All that is good is fair, and what is fair is not disproportionate. Accordingly, an animal that is to be fair must we affirm, be well proportioned. Not a smaller proportion we discern and reason upon them, but of the greatest and most momentous we take no account. For in view of health and sickness and virtue and vice, no proportion or disproportion is more no proportion or disproportion is more important than that existing between body and souls themselves. Yet we pay no heed to these, nor do we reflect that if a feebler and a smaller frame be the vehicle of a soul that is strong and mighty in all respects, or if the relation between the two be reversed, then the entire creature is not fair. For it is defective in the most essential proportions. But the opposite condition is to him who can discern it of all sides the fairest and loveliest. For example, a body which possesses legs of excessive length, or which is unsymmetrical, owing to any other disproportion, is not only ugly, but in taking its share of labor brings infinite distress on itself, suffering frequent fatigue and spasms, and often falling in consequence of inability to control its motion. The same, then, we must suppose to hold good of the combination of soul and body which we call an animal. When the soul in it is more powerful than the body and of ardent temperament, she agitates it and fills it from within with sickness, and when she impetuously pursues some study or research, she wastes the body away, and giving instruction and conducting discussion, private or public, in a spirit of contention and rivalry, she inflames and weakens its fabric and brings on chill. And thus deceiving most of the so-called physicians, induces them to assign causes for the malady, which are really in no way concerned with it. When one, on the other hand, a larger body, too great for the soul, is joined with a small and feeble mind, two kinds of appetites, being natural to mankind on account of the body, a craving for nourishment, and on account of the divinest part of us for knowledge, the motions of the stronger prevail and strengthen their faculty, but that of the soul they render dull and slow of learning and of recollection, and so produce stupidity and most grievous of maladies. There is but one safeguard against both these misfortunes. Neither should the soul be exercised without the body, nor the body without the soul, in order that they may be a match for each other and attain balance in health. So the mathematician, or whosoever is intensely absorbed in any intellectual study, must allow corresponding exercise to his body, submitting to athletic training, while he who is careful in forming his body must in turn give due to exercise to his soul, calling in the aid of art and of all philosophy, if he is justly to be called at once fair and in the true sense good. The same treatment too should be applied to the separate parts in imitation of the fashion of the all. For as the body is inflamed and cooled within, by the particles that enters and again is dried and moistened, by those that are outside, and by the agency of these two forces suffers all that ensues. Upon this condition, if we submit the body passively to the forces aforesaid, it is overcome and destroyed. But if we imitate what we have called the fosteress and nurse of the all, and allow the body, if possible, never to be inactive, but keep it austere and exciting continual vibration in it, furnish it with the natural defense against the motion from without and within, and by moderately exercising it bring into orderly relation with each other according to their affinities, the affections and particles that are going astray in the body. Then, as we have already described in speaking of the universe, we shall not suffer mutually hostile particles to be side by side and to engender discord and disease in the body, but we shall set friend beside friend so as to bring about a happy state. Of all motions, that which arise in any body by its own action is the best, for it is most nearly allied to the motion of thought and of the all. But that which is brought about by other agency is inferior, and the worst of all is that which, while the body is lying still, is produced by other agents which move it piecemeal. Accordingly, of all modes of purifying and restoring the body, gymnastic is the best. The next best is any swinging motion, such as of sailing or any other conveyance of the body which does not tire it. A third kind is useful sometimes under absolute necessity, but in no other circumstances should be employed by a judicious person. I mean medical purgation, affected by drugs. No disease, not an involving imminent danger, should be irritated by drugs. For every form of sickness has a certain correspondence to the nature of living creatures. Their constitution is so ordered as to have definite periods of life, both for the kind and for the individual, which has its own fixed span of existence, always accepting inevitable accidents. For the triangles of each creatures are composed at the very outset with the capacity of holding out for a certain definite time, beyond which its life cannot be prolonged. The same applies also to the constitution of disease. If these are interfered with by medicine to the disregard of their appointed period, it often happens that a few slight maladies are rendered numerous and grave, wherefore we should guide all such sicknesses by careful living, so far as we have time to attend to it, and not provoke a troublesome mischief by medical treatment. So far as concerned the animate creature and the bodily part of it, how a man guiding the latter and by himself being guided should live a most rational life, let this discussion suffice. But the part which is to guide the body must beforehand be trained with still greater care to be most perfect and efficient for education. To deal with this subject minutely would in itself be a sufficient task. But if we may merely touch upon it in conformity with our previous discourse, we should find a consistent answer to the question from the following reflections. As we have often said, three forms of soul with threefold functions are implanted in us, and each of these has its proper motions. Accordingly, we may say as briefly as possible that whichever of these continues in idleness and keeps its own motion inactive, this must needs become the weakest, but that which is in constant exercise waxes strongest. Wherefore, we must see that they exercise their motion in due proportion. As to the supreme form of the soul that is within us, we must believe that God has given it to each of us as a guiding genius. Even that which we say, and say truly, dwells in the summit of our body and raises us from earth towards our celestial affinity. Seeing we are of no earthly but of heavenly growth, since to heaven, whence in the beginning was the birth of our soul, the diviner part attaches the head of root of us and makes our whole body upright. Now, whoso is busied with appetites or ambitions and labors hard after these, all the thoughts of his heart must be altogether mortal. And so far as it is possible for him to become mutually mortal, he falls no whit short of this. For this is what he has been fostering. But he whose heart has been set on the love of learning and on true wisdom, and has chiefly exercised this part of himself, this man must without fail have thoughts that are immortal and divine, if he lay hold upon the truth. And so far as it lies in human nature to possess immortality, he lacks nothing thereof. And seeing that he ever cherishes the divinest part, and keeps in good estate the guardian spirit that dwells in him, he must be happy above all. And the care of this is always the same for every man, to wit, that he assign to every part its proper exercise and nourishment. To the divine part of us are keen the thoughts and revolutions of the all. These every man should follow, restoring the revolutions in the head that are marred through our earthly birth, by learning to know the harmonics and revolutions of the all, so as to render the thinking soul like the object of its thought according to her primal nature. And when he has made it like, so shall he have the fulfillment of that most excellent life that was set by the gods before mankind for time present and time to come. Thus then the task laid upon Thus then the task laid upon us at the beginning to set forth the nature of the universe down to the generation of man seems well nigh to have reached its fulfillment. For the manner of the generation of other animals we may deal with in brief, so there be no need to speak at length. Thus shall we in our own eyes preserve due measure in our account of them. Let us then state it in this way. Of those who were born as men, such as were cowardly and spent their life in unrighteousness, were according to the probable account transformed into women at the second incarnation. At that time the gods for these reasons invented the love of sexual intercourse, in that they created one kind of animate nature in man and another in women, which two they formed in the following way. To the channel of the drink, where it receives the fluid passing down through the lungs beneath the kidneys into the bladder and sends it forth by pressure of the air, they open a passage into the column of marrow which runs from the head down the neck and along the spine, which we have already termed the seat. This being quick with soul and finding an outlet, gave to the part where it found the outlet a lively desire of egress and produced a longing to generate. Wherefore the nature of the generative part in man is disobedient and headstrong, like a creature that will not listen to reason and endeavors to have all its will because of its frantic passions. And again, for the same reason, what is called the matrix in worm and woman, which is in them a living nature, a patent of childbearing, when it is a long time fruitless beyond the due season, is distressed and sorely disturbed, and straying about in the body and cutting off the passages of the breath, it impedes respiration, brings the sufferer into the extremest anguish, and provokes all manner of disease besides, until the passion and love of both unite them, and as it were plucking fruit from a tree, sow in the womb, as if in a field, living things, invisible for smallness and unformed, and again separating them, nourish them within till they grow large, and finally bringing them to light complete, the birth of a living creature. Such is the nature of woman, and all that is female. The tribe of birds was transformed by growing feathers instead of hair, from men that were harmless, but light-minded, who were students of the heavenly bodies, but fancied in the simpleness that the demonstration were most sure concerning them, which they obtained through the sight. And the race of brutes that walk on dry land comes from those who sought not the aid of philosophy at all, nor inquired into the nature of the universe, because they used no longer the revolutions in the head, but followed as their guides the parts of the soul that are in the breast. From these practices their front, limbs, and their heads were by their natural affinity drawn towards the ground, and there supported, and their heads were lengthened out and took all sorts of forms, just as the orbit in each were crushed out of shape through disuse. For the same reason such races were made four-footed and many-footed, for God gave many props to the more senseless creatures, that they might the more be drawn earthward. As to the most senseless of all, whose whole bodies were altogether stretched at length on the earth, seeing they had no longer any need of feet, God made them footless to crawl upon the ground, and the fourth class that lives in the water was formed of the most utterly foolish and senseless of all, whom they are transfigured them thought not worthy even of pure respiration, because their soul was polluted with all manner of iniquity. But in place of inhaling the fine pure element of air, they were thrust into the turbid and lowly respiration of water. Hence is the tribe of fishes and of all shellfish that live in water, which have the uttermost dwelling place in piety for the uttermost folly. In such manner then, and now all creatures change places, one with another, rising or falling with the loss or gain of understanding or of folly. And now let us declare that our discourse concerning this all has reached its end. Having received all mortal and immortal creatures, and being therewith all replenished, this universe hath thus came into being, living and visible, containing all things that are visible, the image of its maker, a God perceptible, most mighty and good, most fair and perfect, even this one and only begotten world that is.